Good evening, everyone. I would like to call the meeting of the Board of Appeals Committee to order at 5:39 p.m. This meeting has been properly noticed and posted according to law. I will now do the roll call of the committee members. Wendy Smith,
Present.
Stephen Isaacson,
Present.
Scott Waligora,
Present.
Kevin Matthews.
Present.
Also present is Inspector Burris and Attorney Bayer. I will now turn the rest of the meeting over to Chief Wendy Smith.
Okay, the first item on our agenda is approval of the minutes drafted for the meeting on January 14th, 2025. Do members have any proposed revisions or amendments to the draft minutes as proposed? Hearing none. All those in favor of approving the minutes say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Hearing none opposed, those draft minutes are approved. We're going to adjust the numbering of our agenda items slightly. We will first address item number 5, which is a request to appeal the interpretation of Village Code 225-8B sub 2 to construct a 6-foot-high driveway gate in the front of the setback area. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I think I'm skipping ahead. Item number 5, request for a variance of Village Code 535-19, E sub 5 regarding maximum lot coverage at residential property 2312 East Lake Bluff Boulevard. How we'll proceed is that first we'll have the village attorney. You can stand at the podium if you like. We'll ask the village attorney to explain the standards by which we must apply for this request. And then we'll have the village's representative make a statement, and then we'll turn it over to the property owner or their representative to make a statement as well. Okay. Attorney Bayer, can you provide us with the legal standard?
Absolutely. Thank you. So what I think I'll do is address first generally the standards associated with a request for a variance and give sort of an overview of the powers of the Board of Appeals, since we have some new members joining us today, and also for the benefit of some of the applicants that might be representing themselves. So items number 5 and 6 are what I would call classic requests for variance. And then I think I'll address item 4 separately because it's a request for a variance with a slight twist to it based upon a previous application. And then item 7 relates to something that was remanded from circuit court that made its way down to the design review board and then back up to the Board of Appeals. So I'll take that one last. So to start with the general, the Village Code, Chapter 535, Article 10 enumerates the powers that the Board of Appeals have. And generally speaking, there's a couple of different things that they do, primarily do. One is if someone alleges that say a village inspector made an error interpreting the building code or the zoning code or something like that, they can challenge that interpretation. For example, if a building permit might be denied based upon an allegation that it violates the code, the building code, or the setback requirements in that code, et cetera, they can say, hey, we want review. The second thing that people can do is request a variance. And a variance is essentially agreeing that what they're asking to construct or erect or whatever it might be is essentially outside the parameters set by the existing building code, but they're arguing that there's some special condition associated with their property where they should be allowed to ignore that portion of the code and build or erect, a fence or build or construct or whatever it might be anyway. Just to give you a very benign example, sometimes we have variance requests where someone wants to put a unit for their air conditioning in their backyard, and because they're on a non-conforming lot that's smaller than the requirements that were listed in the code. In other words, it was created before the building code even came into effect. They might say there's physically nowhere to put it because my lot is smaller than otherwise allowed by the code. My house already is within 2.5 feet of the lot line. Because of that, there's physically nowhere I can put the air conditioning unit. So I'm asking for a variance to put it on the side of my house as opposed to behind the house because it's physically impossible based on my lot. That's sort of one benign example. So the code says that the Board of Appeals has the power to grant appeals for variances if they're not contrary to the public interest and where, due to special conditions, a literal enforcement of the building code would result in practical difficulty of the owner or unnecessary hardship on the owner. But the spirit and purpose of the building code should not be essentially swallowed by the exception. In other words, the exception shouldn't swallow the rule. So as you analyze the request for the variance, if you decide that, yes, there's special circumstances here and there would be no detriment to the neighboring property, if you do that, there's a couple of findings that actually have to be made as part of any vote to grant a variance. And there are two things. The one finding that must be made is exceptional circumstance. And it's defined in Shorewood's code. It says that there must be exceptional, extraordinary, or unusual circumstances or conditions applying to the lot, parcel, or the structure that do not apply generally to other properties in the same district. In other words, other properties in the neighborhood or the same zoning district. And granting the variance would not be of so general or recurrent nature as to suggest that the chapter should be changed. So in other words, once again, the code is telling us the exception shouldn't swallow the rule. The second part is an absence of detriment. And it says that the variance will not create substantial detriment to adjacent property and will not materially impair or be contrary to the purpose and the spirit of this chapter or the public interest. So what we do is first we swear in the applicant, we take any testimony from them or evidence that they want to hear. We also swear in the village inspector who gives us the overview, the 30,000-foot view of why the request was initially denied and explains the code. And then the body has the opportunity to ask questions and you evaluate whether there's exceptional circumstances and absence of detriment that would support granting a variance or not. And then you'll have the opportunity to make a motion. There'd essentially be two motions. One would be to grant the variance based upon a finding that there are exceptional circumstances present and there is no detriment to any neighboring property, or alternatively, simply a motion to deny the request for variance. So those would be the two final outcomes. And once a motion is made and seconded, you would have debate, you would discuss, and then you would vote, and then we would move on to the next agenda item. So the first agenda item that we're looking at does relate to that variance. So you're evaluating exceptional circumstances and absence of detriment under the code.
Thank you. For the benefit of our new members, are there any questions for Attorney Bayer as to the standard? Hearing none. We'll proceed to have Inspector Burris provide a statement on behalf of the village. Can you swear in Inspector Burris? Okay, I guess I'll swear in Inspector Burris. Inspector Burris, can you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you provide today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay, can you provide your name and title, please?
Justin Burris, lead building inspector.
Thank you.
So the property owners of 2312 East Lake Bluff are seeking a variance of the maximum lot coverage standards for a principal structure within the R5 single household zoning district to construct a rear sunroom addition. The proposed addition was reviewed and approved by the Village Design Review Board on January 23rd, subject to a variance being granted by the Board of Appeals. The applicable zoning regulation is 535-19E parent 5, where the maximum allowable lot coverage for a principal structure on an interior lot is 30%. As noted in the January 15th zoning review, the existing lot is non-conforming with respect to the minimum lot area. The R5 district requires that lots are at least 6,000 square feet, and this lot is 5,247 square feet. The zoning review was performed for a house with an attached garage. Since the garage is attached, its square footage was included with the principal building lot coverage. Had it not been attached, the associated square footage would have been calculated and reviewed separately under an accessory structure lot coverage, which can occupy up to 10% of the lot. Within the packet, we have the zoning review and the associated plans for the structure, as well as the Board of Appeals application and pictures and materials that the applicant has provided.
I'll open this up for the board for questions of Inspector Burris. Inspector Burris, it looks like the property owners or their representative dispute the nature of the garage as to whether it truly is an attached structure. It appears that it is actually abutting the home, but they allege that there's no actual entry from the home into the garage. Can you provide some clarification on that?
Sure. So, yes, ac- there is, say, some debate as to, accessory structure, accessory use. When the building is, so the primary building includes the dwelling unit and other things, including storage of vehicles. So while this property in particular, this house, it is true that there is no typical house to garage door. You cannot get into the garage from the house. There is no living space above the garage. It is still physically attached. And so that is why we compute it as part of the 30% and don't parse it out and say, well, it's accessory to the principal dwelling. Again, we sort of need to make this determination because if at any point in time, an attached garage can be converted to living space. There are instances where there is living space above a garage. And so we maintain consistency in that when the structures are physically attached, even if it through a breezeway of a roof, then that all should be computed as principal building.
And for those following along online, it looks like the packet agenda item begins on 59 of 183 in the downloadable PDF.
And so the letter on page 65 confirms that as proposed, this would be a 31.6% lot coverage.
That is correct.
And that is above the 30%
Yes.
standard. Okay. Any further questions for Inspector Burris? I have one more, but I don't want to monopolize the time. Looking at the overhead photo on page 60, the lot shape is not rectilinear. It's not a rectangle.
It is not non-traditional.
Would you consider that to be unusual for this particular neighborhood or this zoning district?
Yes.
Okay. Any additional questions for Inspector Burris?
A question on the size of the structure, like what size, I think it's 400 square feet. What
Oh, the
size,
size
what
of
size
the-
what's 1.6?
The size of the, say,
Like if you
proposed
shrunk that
sunroom?
400, like, is it,
Oh, sure. Honestly, we didn't do the calculations as to if you shrunk
I
it.
think I read it was unusable.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll say maybe the applicant can speak to that a little bit more because they have some of that information included in their appeal application.
If you look at the letter we submitted, I don't know what page it is in the packet. We have-
63.
We have the, under question 1, we have the current calculation, and that's the 31.6 you said. But then we have below that, if you add that 400 square feet, that's not part of the lot, that corner that's cut out of the lot, we're under the 29.3%.
Have you done that calculation yourself, Inspector Burris, or do you agree with that?
I do believe that's accurate, yeah.
Okay. Any further questions for Inspector Burris before we move on to the property owner or his or her representative? Hearing none. Is there a representative for the property owner who'd like to make a statement?
I mean, you covered it
Let
well.
me swear you in first.
Yes.
Can I have your name, and are you the property owner?
I'm not. I'm the architect.
Okay, can you provide your name, please?
My name is Josh Ayer.
Josh Ayer,
With two-
EHR.
Yes,
And can you raise your hand, please? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you provide today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay, you can provide your statement now. Thank you.
What more would you like me to provide?
What additional information that perhaps we have not yet covered explains the need for a variance and what exceptional circumstances apply to this particular property?
Well, I think you covered it pretty well. The irregular lot reduces the ability to build the addition. We're the only irregular lot on the block, and that lack of 400 square feet that's cut out of the upper left corner of the property brings us to that 31.6% that we're over the limit. And if we were to have to build within that limit, if we don't consider any of the things we're going for today, the room would be too small. It'd be unusable. It'd be about half the size it is now. So aside from the attached versus detached argument that we have in the letter, like we said, by doing the calculation, if that 400 square foot was part of the property, we would be within the limit.
Okay. Questions for Mr. Ayer? For the clerk's office, while we're thinking about that, have we received any communication from neighboring properties that received notice regarding this request? No? Okay.
I guess the only question I have is if you did this the way that you're planning to do it, does it draw attention to it?
It's not visible from the street, so it doesn't affect anything on the street character. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty minimal in its size. And it's, as the design review board said, it's very complementary to the existing house style.
And is it, your letter kind of alludes to the current placement of the attached garage. From your understanding, was that required due to the unconventional shape of
it's
the property?
It's an assumption. When looking at an aerial map, most of the other homes have detached garages that have rectangular lots. So this one with that back corner cut out, you couldn't push the garage to the back of the property. It had to stay forward, therefore attached to the house.
Okay. Any additional questions for Mr. Ayer? Is there any other further statement you'd like to provide? All right, thank you. All right, you can have a seat.
Okay.
All right, I'll move for the purposes of ending the testimony phase of this hearing to enter into discussion amongst board members. I will move to grant the request for a variance of Village Code 535-19E5 regarding maximum lot coverage at residential property 2312 East Lake Bluff Boulevard as meeting the criteria for having exceptional circumstances relating to the lot, parcel, or structure, being not so general in nature to require an amendment to the village code, and having an absence of substantial detriment to neighboring properties. Is there a second of that motion to bring us into discussion phase? Thank you. So we'll enter into discussion now. If any board member would like to voice their thoughts on this, it's an open forum for discussion. Personally, I think that we've had credible testimony from Inspector Burris showing that the property shape is unusual for this neighborhood, and the unusual nature of the garage being attached but not really attached simply abutting, which would push the maximum lot coverage only slightly over the 30%, and we're bumped up to 31.6%. It seems to me as though we can justify granting a variance here due to exceptional circumstances relating to the unique nature of this particular lot. No neighboring properties, or it doesn't seem like neighboring properties would be requesting for a variance for similar reasons. And my understanding is that we haven't received any kind of communication from neighbors saying that there would be a detriment to their neighboring properties. But those are just my thoughts. Any additional thoughts that anyone would like to share?
Just a question, how were the neighbors?
So the clerk's office provides notice of this hearing to certain neighboring properties. Sometimes we receive emails or letters, or neighboring property owners come and attend the hearing to either voice support or objection to whatever the proposed project is. When I asked Mai earlier if we had received anything like that, sometimes, the clerk's office will share with us emails of someone saying, I don't oppose this. But it sounds like we have not received anything from neighboring properties. Okay. Are we ready to proceed to a vote? Okay. Mai, you can go alphabetically, you can.
Wendy Smith,
So just for clarification, this is a motion to approve the requested variance for this property as meeting the criteria for variance, I guess. Okay, go ahead.
Wendy Smith,
Aye.
John Tuenhoff,
Oh, John is,
I'm abstaining.
yeah.
Stephen Isaacson,
Aye.
Scott Wally Goro,
Aye.
Kevin Matthews.
Aye.
Motion carries 4-0.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, variance is granted. You will receive some kind of written confirmation from the clerk's office. You're welcome. All right. At this point, I'd like to enter into the record the fact that John Tutenhoff has started attending the meeting and will proceed from now on. We'll return to item number 4, which is a revisit of a request for a variance of Village Code 225-8 sub 2 to construct a 6-foot-high driveway gate in front of the setback area at residential property located at 3926 North Lake Drive. At this point, I'll ask Attorney Bayer to give us both a legal standard and perhaps some of the background on this particular request.
Thank you. So once again, we have a request for a variance. So ultimately, the evaluation will be based upon exceptional circumstances and absence of detriment. However, there's one complicating factor with respect to this particular application. That is, in June of 2023, there was a prior request to this same body seeking a variance for the very same condition and requesting to construct a 6-inch high driveway gate in the setback area. And that request followed a denial by the inspector's office. The Board of Appeals in June of 2023 did evaluate that and discussed it, and ultimately denied the request for the variance at that time. So my opinion and advice to the board is based upon a general concept under the law called stare decisis, which is essentially a fancy way of saying, you generally follow your past precedent. And the reason for that is, of course, that we don't want to encourage applicants to keep coming back and say, well, let's give it another kick at the cat 6 months down the road or a year down the road. Or I noticed that there's a few different appointments now to the Board of Appeals. Let's give it another try. You generally don't want to encourage that kind of a thing. So, there is one caveat, though, to following past precedent. And I think that is if there is a substantial change with respect to the property itself or the circumstances surrounding the request for a variance. So, something related to physical layout or characteristics, then I think there's justification to say that due to a change in circumstance since the last application, it's appropriate to consider granting a variance where we did not last time, and that's justifiable, and it doesn't set a bad precedent for the Board of Appeals by saying, well, you know, they ruled this way and the circumstances are exactly the same, and now they rule a different way. So for consistency's sake, you know, my advice to the Board of Appeals, based upon that generalized concept of stare decisis, is that if you don't find that there's any substantial change in the physical layout or characteristics of the property, that you adhere to your past precedent or recent past precedent of the denial of the variance in June of 2023. But again, I do not vote, of course, as the attorney advising the body. That is ultimately up to you. And, you know, you will have to decide the issue and discuss all of those issues and evaluate whether the variance is warranted, both based upon any changes and the criteria laid out in the ordinance, and then take a vote one way or another. I will, just for the individuals who are new to the process, this was previously discussed. There was a failed action because there was a tied vote of 2-2, which means under Robert's Rules of Order, the motion failed and therefore there was no action taken by the body. And so my opinion was that the applicant was entitled to a decision that they could then, you know, either move forward with or seek a review of. And so my advice was to bring the matter back when we had a quorum and an odd number of members to evaluate the issue for a second time, and then take a vote and see what happens.
Questions for questions for Attorney Bayer before we move on to testimony? And just for clarification, that at first, or I suppose the second request for variance, that was heard the immediately prior meeting to this one. So last month's meeting is when we had our tie vote, just to clarify. Okay, hearing no questions, do you have a preference as to, I'd like to get a statement from Inspector Burris first. Is that, okay. Inspector Burris, would you like to provide a summary of this request for variance?
Yes, so I'll just read into the record the memo that I had at the last meeting, that the village received a building permit application on 10/22/2024 to install a 6-foot-high ornamental fence and gate within the front yard and setback, which exceeds the maximum allowable height of 4 feet. The permit application was denied, and the village received a Board of Appeals application on 11/7/2024. As stated previously, the Board of Appeals considered an appeal for the same installation on June of 2023, and at that time, the appeal was denied. Subsequently, a building permit 23-0532 was issued for a 4-foot portion of the front yard fence and wall that included the following stipulation: fencing and gates in excess of 4 feet in height within the front yard setback are not permitted or approved as part of this permit. The applicable regulations are 2258B, parent 2. All fences erected or constructed in the front yard setback area as established under the provisions of 535-19E of the Village Code shall be limited to a height of no more than 4 feet. And then the front setback area is 25 feet, or the average of the existing setbacks on the side of the street where the property is located between the two closest intersecting streets. And then we just have the definition of a fence, which is a barrier enclosing or bordering a field, yard, etc., usually made of posts and wood used to prevent entrance, to confine, or to mark a boundary.
All right, thank you. Questions for Inspector Burris?
I don't know if it's a question. Is there any?
I suppose we can ask Inspector Burris, do you think there are any exceptional circumstances relating to this particular property?
Not offhand that I've been able to ascertain.
For the two requests for a building permit. There was one in October of 2024 and another previously in 2023.
Yeah,
Were the plans changed in any way?
no.
Additional questions before we transition to property owners? Hearing none. Thank you, Inspector Burris. Counsel for the property owners, I believe you have a PowerPoint
I
presentation?
do. Thank
Okay.
you so much. My name is Debbie Tomczyk with Reinhardt Berner. I'm representing Eric and Ashley Higgins, who are the owners of the property, and I appreciate welcome to the new members. And thank you for the indulgence of those who have been through this before. I will be more brief than last time.
Well,
But
take
I,
as much time as you need to because we have
Thank you.
members here that have not
haven't
heard the
heard it.
story yet.
all right, excellent. So if I can burden you to pull up the PowerPoint, that would be terrific. As was indicated before, and if you could go to the next slide. We have been here before, and it was in June of 23, so it was almost 2 years ago when the board voted 2-3, and that was a very close vote as well, not to grant the variance for the 6-foot gateway driveway. Since June, there have been some changed circumstances. Traffic and safety concerns along Lake Drive, including trespassing, have continued to intensify. And the Higgins have also had to install significant bluff stabilization in the back of their property, a physical change to the property as well. It also renders the traversing from Lake Drive to Lake Michigan much more treacherous. So as was indicated, January of 14th, the board voted 3-1 to deny a request to appeal an interpretation of the code. And we deadlocked at the board 2-2 on a motion to deny the variance, as Attorney Beyer said. So there was no action taken on the variance request. We can go to the next slide. I want to be sure you're clear on what exactly is there today. So this is the property as it is today. So that is the fence that's in existence at that location that has been constructed consistent with the permitting that was issued to us. So that's what the property looks like today. And the only thing that's at issue is at the next slide, if you could. It is just that gateway area, the front, the middle portion of that does extend up to 6 feet. But that's the only thing that's at issue is what's in the red box today. And if we can go to the next slide, I think it's also helpful to understand what the property looks like from an aerial perspective. Part of the reason that we have so many trespassers and we have people coming into the driveway and turning around is because of the configuration of the driveway. You'll see it's a large circle, so people do come in. In fact, we actually had an incident yesterday where we had trespassers and the police were at the property to ask the trespassers to leave. So it's been continuing and intensifying that we've experienced those. You'll also see, unique to the property, that we're more than 74 feet from our neighbor across the street, given the configuration of Lake Drive at that location and the sidewalk, the configuration of the property, all things that are unique to the property and that we think justify and make sure that we're not causing a detriment to our neighbors and something that's exceptional to the property. If I could go to the next slide. Why are we asking for this gate? We have continued, especially in the last 18, 20 months, seen an intensification of trespassers coming in. Yesterday, in particular, top of mind, there was an incident where the police had to visit the property and ask trespassers to vacate. So it's been recent and it's been a concern to the neighbors and to our property owners. We have disruptive vehicle turnarounds, as you saw with the driveway, where we have people coming in, turning around, exiting the property. So another reason why the gate is important for us. And speeding. In fact, in an incident that happened subsequent to June 23, we had a speeder coming by and we had a vehicle that actually struck the family dog. It ended up resulting in several broken bones and several surgeries for the dog. That's something that happened since the June 23 decision by the SPOTY. We also have in the record that we have letters of support from the neighbors both to the north and to the south. So there's no absence of detriment under your standard. I could go to the next slide. Just a moment about what exactly is at the code. And this was discussed at the last meeting, but I wanted to mention it also to those who are here. And we heard it from Inspector Burris. The code section that's at issue is 225-8B. 1 says all fences which extend 16 linear feet or more, or which are erected or constructed to a height of more than 4 feet are allowed. They just require a building permit. Under 4, it says no fence may be erected or constructed which exceeds a height of 6 feet. We're not exceeding a height of 6 feet. So the code section that's at issue here is B2. All fences erected or constructed in the front setback as established under the provisions of 535-19E5 of the code are limited to no more than 4 feet. If we can go to the next slide, that code section 535-19E is for the R2 district, the R2 residence district. It is not for the R5 residence district. And if you could go to the next slide, our property is not in the R2 district, it is in the R5 district. This is the zoning code, or the zoning map from the village of Shorewood. Our property is where the blue notation is. If we could go to the next slide. So by its plain language, 225-8B2 does not apply to the R2 district. There's no variance that really should be needed. That said, on January 14th of 25, the board seemed to recognize that there was an issue with the plain language that does not require a variance, but they looked to the intent of the ordinance and how it had been viewed in the past. But under clear black letter statutory case law, where statutory language is unambiguous and there is no need to consult sources of interpretation such as legislative history, in construing and interpreting a statute, the court is not at liberty to disregard the plain and clear language of the statute. And you folks are sitting in a quasi-judicial circumstance.
Can we focus on the answer?
Yeah, so
I will be there.
at the
Just
last-
1 second.
That-
Give me
This
2
was
seconds.
decided at the last meeting.
At the last meeting, we considered a request for interpretation to allow, and that failed. And the only thing up for consideration today is a request for a variance.
I
And so the
understand.
standards which we need to hear from you is relating to a variance.
I understand.
Okay.
So I do think that's important for the new members to understand sort of where we're coming from, but let's go to the next slide. We do understand and respect and are willing to try to reconcile with the opinion of the board and its advisors. So as was decided and is reported in your January 14th, 25 minutes, board members were trying to determine whether they are obligated to hear the variance of a situational change versus property changes. And absent evidence of a substantial change in the property, they deadlocked it 2-2. Then in an email that Attorney Baer sent, and I think he recited that again, he said if there was a substantial change in physical layout characteristics of the property, then it might be appropriate to consider a variance the second time around. Shorewood's code doesn't tell us what constitutes a change in circumstance. It doesn't include any prohibitions. Many codes do include prohibitions against coming back at some period of time. That's not something that's included in the Village of Shorewood's code. Nor does it include any provisions, again, that tell us what constitutes changed circumstances. So if we could go to the next slide. So the zoning treatise that everyone looks to about what constitutes, to fill in sort of the gaps on where things are at, Rathkoff's tells us a new application for administrative relief, which is what we're requesting, may be considered by a board if there's a substantial change either in proposed use or plans or the circumstances or conditions relevant to the application. And if we could go to the next slide, this is new. So since something that has happened since June of 23 is the Lake Bluff stabilization that's happened at the property that makes the traversing between Lake Drive and Lake Michigan more difficult, more treacherous, more susceptible to potential injury. And that is an existing condition that has changed since we've been here before. If you go to the next slide, a couple more photos of what that looks like. And the bluff stabilization, I think, is something many people along Lake Michigan are encountering, but this is the unique circumstance and solution at this property to make sure that the bluff has been stabilized. If we can go to the next slide. We are concerned about The changed circumstances also in the area evidenced by the police incident at our property yesterday, the hitting of the family dog that happened since June of 23. There are additional crashes that have happened along this stretch of Lake Michigan, or of Lake Drive, almost 2.5 times an increase since 2020 to 2024. And if you could go to the next slide, these are just the Department of Transportation notations of where crashes have occurred along this stretch of Lake Drive since 2020. First, and all the little bubbles are the various points where crashes have occurred. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see additional bubbles that have been added along where crashes have occurred along this stretch of Lake Drive. Something also that is unique and intensifying since we've been here before. And one more slide, if you go to the next slide, just in the current traffic accident history along this stretch of Lake Drive. You can go to the next slide. You also see this particular area of Lake Drive is very well traveled, as I'm sure everybody knows. This is, again, the Department of Transportation's current traffic counts on Lake Drive. You're looking at the north end, 14,200 cars per day, vehicles per day. At the south end, 18,200 vehicles per day. Contrast that with what happens in the neighborhood streets where you've got a couple of thousand trips per day that occur. So this is a very well-traveled portion of Lake Drive. And next slide. You folks are also probably aware that this portion of Lake Drive is also going to be under construction. We're on the verge of doing that, which also causes us some additional safety concerns. And the next slide is the village's crime statistics, which also show that there have been increased crime incidents, especially on the south side of Shorewood. So if we could go to the next slide. The exceptional circumstances. This board specifically has found exceptional circumstances when a property's location presents safety concerns and/or proposes a safety threat to residents. And in particular, I'd call your attention to the July 24th granting of a variance for 4442 North Lake Drive or something very similar. And the rationale in your minutes was that there were 2 drunk driving incidents, as well as trespassers using their property to gain access to the rear area. That's something that happened subsequent to June 23 when we first made our variance application. The absence of detriment standard, again, you've recognized absence of detriment when adjacent property owners do not object to any proposed construction, and that's the case here. We actually have letters of support from the neighbors to the north and to the south. If we could go to the next slide. Specifically, this is the type of gate for which a variance was granted in July of 24 by this board at 4442 North Lake Drive. The rationale being 2 drunk driving incidents, as well as trespassers using the property to gain access to the rear of the area. And the board agreed that an 8-foot fence, in this case, we're asking for a 6-foot fence, but here an 8-foot fence was granted a variance. If you could go to the next slide. This is basically what we're looking for, is the variance that was granted for 3510 North Lake Drive in 2022 for a 6-foot tall gate fence. The precedent that you have to look at is not just what's happened to this property. The precedent you have to look at is the other variances that have been granted in similar circumstances with similarly situated property owners. It doesn't justify treating us any differently from how these folks have been treated. And you'll see that in the next couple of slides as well. Similar grants of fence variances for 2500 East Olive, the next slide. And then there was one for 4076 North Downer at the next. And the undisputed testimony of the Board of Appeals in the record for our property establishes there are actually 8 other properties on the east side of Lake Drive with higher fences than what we're proposing. And what we're proposing is just the 2-foot increase to justify and to deal with the exceptional circumstances, the Lake Bluff restoration that's happened in the back, which has been different, and a changed physical circumstance that happened since 2023, as well as the intensified traffic incidents, safety concerns that we've seen since 2023. So if we could just my last slide. I'm sure everyone's happy. So we're hoping that you will grant us the variance based on changed circumstances at our property and the board's precedent that has been adopted for 4442 North Lake Drive, 3510 North Lake Drive, and 4076 North Downer Avenue, which there's no justification to treat our property and our request any different than those variances that were granted. So I will pause for any questions. I very much appreciate your consideration. And again, focus on the fact that what we're looking for is just the security and safety of a 2-foot expansion of the driveway gate to complete the fencing that's already been installed, consistent with code and permitting.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Um,
And
is
if you
the-
could try to speak into the microphone so that we can
Oh,
have
I'm
a
sorry.
record.
All right, so, we've been through this before.
Yes.
I don't want to belabor. I was just curious, the design, is the design more decorative? I mean, I realize that the
Mhm.
request for 8-foot or 6-foot fence,
Mhm.
but the design is architecturally decorative.
Yes.
Is that a factor here?
When you say a factor, so
Well, I mean, you could have a 6-foot fence without
Mhm.
an architectural flourish or whatever you want to call that fence. So I guess my question is this as much aesthetic as it is other?
It
Or
is-
Is it just a way of solving the same problem with an aesthetic flourish at the top of it?
So one of the factors is the absence of detriment to the neighborhood. We think this fits the best with the neighborhood and achieves the security concerns that we have. So hopefully we're achieving both goals.
Okay, that was my question. Thank you.
So
The request is just limited,
At this point, yes.
so you can go 6 inches either side.
Yes.
So as to the security concerns about trespassers and people coming onto the property, why is a 6-foot gate needed as opposed to a 4-foot gate? Because I believe under the code, a 4-foot gate would be permissible. Why is a 6-foot gate? Do you anticipate that would be more secure at
yes.
preventing trespassers
It
from
would be
coming
more
over?
secure to deter trespassers because it's harder to scale.
But the fence immediately to the side is only 4 feet.
But with landscaping full around and piers next to it. So
And I did have a question about page 7 is like a overhead view of the property.
Mhm.
Does that fence continue on all the way to the back of the property?
it does not. No, just the front. It's then screened with tree lining on the sides, so it goes up to the tree line.
So is the fence just at the front
It's at the
setback?
front. Mhm.
And then back 12 feet? Okay. So if that's clear, it's kind of like a U shape? Okay. I think that's the photography. There's some big cypress looking things or whatever those are.
You see that in the aerial.
And so have there been changes to the plan when they were proposed in 2023 as opposed to when they were proposed in 2024?
The physical changes to the property are the Lake Bluff stabilization in the back.
No, I mean like the architectural plan for the fence and the gate.
The gate has not changed.
Okay.
Because again, we think that's the most aesthetically pleasing to what we're proposing.
So there's a feeling that more people are trespassing because the change to the bluff in the back? And
No,
that's why they're choosing this property over the neighbors who have no fence or no tree line?
so there's changed circumstances based on intensification of traffic concerns and safety concerns in the area overall. This property is probably more attractive for that based on the circle drive that you saw.
People driving, then you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
But a 4-foot fence would prevent a 4-foot gate would prevent a car from going into the property.
It would prevent that. It would not prevent any trespassers by foot. That's true.
But they could hop over the 4-foot fence immediately to the side.
I think it's more difficult for them to get over
for the trees.
The higher fence and that aesthetic. Yep.
Okay. For the concerns about traffic, crashes, crime, I have a concern there that that is general in nature and applies not only to this property but to all properties in the same neighborhood or district. Do you think that those concerns apply just as easily to the neighbors when it comes to crashes, traffic, trespassers even? I mean, this is Lake Drive. So what is it about this property that's unique that makes it more susceptible to those concerns?
I think if you look at the location of where some of those crashes have occurred based on DOT statistics, they're proximate to our property. And the Circle Drive is part of the concern. What's attracting potential, again, we had somebody running into the family dog when they turned around in the yard.
And that was in the circle? Okay. Do you think that there's an increase in traffic? I hate to bring up COVID here, but your statistics go back to 2020 as it relates to crime increase and traffic increase. Do you think that's part and due to COVID?
I don't know if you went back, I only went back as far as 2016. There was some uptick, went down in COVID for sure, and then it went up higher.
And so have the property owners experienced trespassers trying to access the beach from their property?
Yes.
Okay. Additional questions?
Part of that is also location proximate to the park. We're pretty close to the park.
Go ahead.
Question related to this is the extra 8 portion. Anybody else?
There's
I'm
a
just not seeing the connect. That was a big part.
there's a deterrent associated with the height of the fence. If it's higher, you're deterring passersby from coming by. I think a lot of it's a visual, try to discourage people from coming in regardless of what the purpose is.
So
What is this?
Well, we're trying to deter, the gate would deter speeders, but it will also deter bikers. It would deter passersby on foot, anyone trying to get to traverse over our property.
Thank you.
if the property owner would like to make a statement, I'd prefer if he come up to the podium so that we can hear it on the record and we can swear him in as well. Your name, please.
Eric.
Do you swear or affirm, you may raise your hand if you would like to, excuse the formalities. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you provide today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Okay, you can proceed. Thank you. And try to speak into the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Including the person yesterday, the 2 kids going to walk down the hill. You have, as you walk to our backyard, you're blind to what you're walking into. And there's 3 15-foot tall walls that don't have a railing. So if you walk and fall off that, that's going to, it's a public safety. I just don't want anybody to get hurt. And we had to put them in because we had fissures in our bluff that we had to repair so our house wouldn't fall down the hill.
So when were those, the bluff restoration?
Last summer.
Last summer, okay.
Took them for summer.
Okay. Additional questions for either the property owner or council? No? I believe, any final statement that property owners would like to provide?
No, we appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.
Thank you. For the purposes of entering into a discussion phase, if anyone else would like to make a motion, they may, but I will go ahead and do it for the benefit of the group if you wish. I'll make a motion for consideration to grant the request for a variance of Village Code 225-8B sub 2 to construct a 6-foot-high driveway gate in front of the setback area at residential property located at 3926 North Lake Drive, as meeting our criteria for granting a variance. Is there a second to enter consideration?
I'll second it.
Thank you. We'll enter into a discussion phase amongst board members. to discuss whether this property meets our criteria of exceptional circumstances and absence of detriment. Does anyone have any preliminary thoughts, Stephen?
Yeah, just, I want to just, because we have new, we were deadlocked at 2-2. But one of the arguments in favor of granting, pointed out, attorney, we had exactly the same other family that was here granted, but exactly the same reason. And while I realized that request for variance failed in 23, circumstances on Lake Drive were what drove us to grant the variance property. Exactly the same. I vote last time, and I voted because it was consistent with what and I would not think that case was made that danger, the driving, trespassing, all of that made very clear in July, and hence we voted for the variance. No different. Thing that makes this even more interesting, have the driveway and the turnaround, the other property. We did grant the other property an 8-foot fence. So it's the same. I think the circumstances have changed in the neighborhood. I agree with that. Well, pointed out here, with traffic crashes, whether it's 6 feet or 8 feet, needs to be addressed. Other person that was here no longer is here, so members wanted to explain what my thinking was voting.
I was on both those votes too, and I'm not going to justify my vote one way or another. As you've illustrated, and I have, all of us have, it's always a case by case situation. We find something different and unique about each circumstance. So yeah, so I wouldn't say they're exactly the same.
Well, we have a
But-
precedent. That was my point. We had exactly the same discussion, the same criteria, and we voted aye. And
But we still take it all case by case.
I understand.
I think the argument of having all the other ones in there is moot. They don't stand. Everybody that was brought up had different circumstances to them. So it's not all just 6 feet.
No, my
it
point
wasn't-
was that this is how I think. We had a precedent. We voted for it in July. To me, this is the same case. I am talking about consistency. And that's it. You know, they're architecturally different. The reasons for voting in July are the same reasons that they're asking for here. It's just a matter of architectural difference. But we do have a precedent, and I think that precedent, as in a court law, is important. And that's just my feeling. But hence, I'm explaining my vote.
I don't necessarily want to sway the other members of the board as to why I previously voted on the 2 prior votes on this particular variance that I participated in. But I do want to say that I agree with John that we should look at each matter that comes before us on a case-by-case basis, acknowledging that there have been many different board members over years and years of this body being considering requests for variances, and past precedent doesn't necessarily reflect my own interpretation of the municipal ordinance as it relates to granting a variance or not. So for me, I look to the specific nature of the property to determine whether it meets the criteria for granting a variance. Here, I don't find the argument about safety particularly persuasive, given that the property is not fully surrounded by a fence. The fence that is in existence is only 4 feet. Is there a material difference between a 4-foot gate and a 6-foot gate? I am not terribly convinced that there is, other than it looks prettier. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. One of my major concerns is that we're required to grant a variance only when granting one would be not so general or recurrent of a nature as to suggest that the municipal zoning code chapter should be changed. And so one of the arguments of the property owners is that, well, there are other people on Lake Drive that have this type of ornamental 6-foot gate. And perhaps many properties on Lake Drive would like to have that gate. And it becomes a question of whether it's appropriate for this body to grant variances for each of those properties, given that they have very similar circumstances due to their, location, traffic, trespassers due to wanting to go to the beach, or whether it's more appropriate for the village to amend the municipal ordinances to allow for a 6-foot gate, which the village could do. And so I'm stuck on that point in particular as to whether this is really a more recurrent request that would repeat itself amongst other properties in this district. But other members may share their opinions, or we can proceed to a vote if that's what we desire to do. Any other thoughts? Hearing none. Shall we proceed to a vote then? Okay. So my prior motion was to grant the variance. Mai, can you hold a vote, please?
Wendy Smith,
Nay.
John Tuenhoff,
Aye.
Stephen Isaacson, Scott Walligora,
Nay.
Kevin Matthews.
Aye.
Variance is granted. All right, moving on to item number 6 on our agenda, which is a request for a variance of zoning ordinance 535-19F sub 4 regarding setbacks at residential property 4144 North Morris Boulevard. Let's see. Is there a property owner present for? Okay, great. I'll first ask Inspector Burris to provide a statement. Well, this is a request for a variance, so our legal standard still applies the same one we've been using. Attorney Bayer, any additional? Okay. Inspector
one-
Burris, would you like to provide a statement?
One
then?
second, please. Can you
Yes.
just tell us what page
Oh, yes.
we're at for this?
78.
Yes, page 78. Inspector Burris.
Yes, thank you. The property owner of 4144 North Morris Boulevard is seeking a variance of the setback requirements for a detached accessory structure within the R6 1 and 2 household residence district to construct a new detached garage. The applicable zoning regulations are 535-19F parent 4, B and C. So the minimum rear and side yard setbacks are 3 feet. As noted in the February 13th zoning review, the existing lot and proposed improvements are all conforming with respect to their size and lot coverage requirements, with the exception for the requested 1-foot encroachment into the rear and side yard setback. Within the packet, we have the building permit application and plans, the zoning review, the denial letter, and the Board of Appeals application with information the applicant.
All right, thank you. And for clarification, so that means that the proposed garage allows a 2-foot setback on
Correct,
the
yes.
rear and the side instead of a 3.
Correct.
Okay. Questions for Inspector Burris? Is there an existing garage on the property?
There is, yes.
Okay, so this would be a tear down of the current and then,
Yes, and I believe the pictures illustrate, so I want to say that they have more of a 1-car garage with a carport-ish off the side. So they're taking down a smaller garage and putting up a larger 2-car garage. Again, still within the allowable area requirement.
Did the proposed plans include an expansion of the concrete pad of the driveway, to your knowledge?
I don't, I suppose at the entrance to the garage, it may be increasing slightly, yes.
Okay.
Were there any comments from adjoining landowners?
Mai, have you received any notes from neighboring properties as to this request? No? Oh,
There's a
do we
hand.
have do we have? Okay, if you'd like to make a statement, I'll ask you after I have the property owner come up. Is that okay? Okay. Any further questions for Inspector Burris? Hearing none. Thank you. The property owner or their representative, you can approach the podium. Yeah, can you provide your name, please?
Yeah, Griffith Watson.
Awesome. And can you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you provide today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay. What can you tell us about your property and kind of the unique or special circumstances that should require a variance to be granted?
Yeah, so we're applying for the variance on the rear and the side. The rear specifically, there is a retaining wall that's directly behind our garage. One of those pictures shows an old railroad tie retaining wall that's crumbling. It's right behind our garage. So the setback, the variance in the setback proposes to use the garage, the new garage itself at 2 feet from the lot line to act as a retaining wall to hold up the property behind us. So they'll build the lower portion of the garage out of concrete block in order to replace that retaining wall and to better maintain the property owners behind us, their grading. I've spoken to them about that and they were fine with it. It actually improves the runoff and things like that. So drain tile and everything will be installed. That variance, along with the variance to the side yard, was advised by our contractor due to the amount of distance between our house and the garage in order to be able to get a second car into the parking spot furthest from the side yard. I think the distance is sub 25 feet, which is recommended between our house and where the garage would be with the 3-foot setback on the side and the rear. So the foot to the side, foot to the rear will allow us to have enough room to get that second car into garage, which would be like the north side of our garage. They are going to pour a little bit larger concrete in front of the garage. I think that's the question. Just to allow for 2 cars to be able to get in. So there's pictures on there of the space to the side of the current garage. It's unused space. So nothing that would incur on our yard, or the garage won't block the sun or anything to the side yard that we're asking for the variance for. So really just lot sizes were initially proposed for, or our lot size and where our house wasn't built was initially proposed for a 2-car garage. So making it unique that now that people have 2 cars and want to put them both in a garage, that we just need a little bit extra space to be able to maneuver the car into that spot. We'd also love to be able to replace that old crumbling retaining wall with a nice solid block garage.
All right. Questions for the property owner? Looks as though the existing garage might be kind of tight to begin with. So does the current size and placement of the garage act as a hindrance to meaningful use of the garage as it currently stands?
We can fit one of our cars in there, and then, yeah, with the current, it's the carport-ish, it's kind of a deck on the side. Yeah, we can only fit 1 car in there, and that's not really suitable for what we need in shuffling cars and street parking.
Mhm.
Or wood stuff.
Yeah. And if we were to imagine the garage being placed 1 foot closer to your home and 1 foot into the property, do you think you would have difficulty turning and navigating into the garage?
Yes, that was the main suggestion from the contractor, that applying for the variance and setback would allow us more room to make the 2-car garage usable for 2 vehicles to be able to park in there easily without.
Can I ask you a question? Can you tell me what slide 89?
I believe he's talking about the picture of the retaining wall.
Yeah.
It's all railroad ties, like
Yeah,
wood.
so it's snowy. There's a couple railroad ties that are directly behind our garage. There's a retaining wall that's right behind our garage. And so we're proposing to basically replace that retaining wall with the garage. And then the pieces that we need to patch in from that maybe aren't where a garage would be built, we'll build retaining.
So the neighbor is to the right?
That neighbor, I'm sorry, so the retaining wall is on my property that we are on, and so that neighbor is directly behind us that would be affected. So that's the rear for the retaining wall. That's your question?
Oh, I'm just trying to get a perspective on what. So this is the.
Do
This,
you mind if I look at what you're looking at?
yeah,
Yeah. Yep. So that is.
You can pull any microphone over there.
Sure. So that is the rear of our garage that we're looking at there. And so then there's this fence that you can see over that black tub. That is the lot line. So we're looking to just replace that retaining wall that's crumbling.
okay, got it.
But what is the setback now for,
They're both at 3.
is it?
It is at 3 now. Essentially, yeah. So then if we did have to, if we weren't granted the variance to the rear, we'd have to build a new retaining wall and then put the garage even further forwards because of where the a new wall would have to be.
And what is the purpose of the retaining wall? Is it due to changes in elevation?
Yeah,
Does that-
changes in elevation between the lot to our rear and then our lot.
Okay. Any additional questions for the property owner? Hearing none. Any additional statement you'd like to provide?
No, thank you.
All right, thank you. Are there any other interested parties that would like to make a statement? Please feel free to come up to the microphone and introduce yourself.
Hello, excuse me. My name is James Maloney, and I am the property owner to the south,
Okay,
which would be affected by the side setback.
and may I swear you in?
Pardon me?
May I swear you in,
Oh,
please?
sure,
Can you raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you provide today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Okay, what can you tell us about either your support or objection to the proposed
We
variance?
have an objection to it for several reasons. One being that we spend a lot of time sitting on our deck in the backyard. And I think moving the garage over and just kind of makes a more imposing structure to have to look at, kind of from a just how the appearance of it. And then secondly, in understanding that, yeah, there'll be a 2 foot setback plus the time you do the additional foot for the overhang and another half foot for the gutter, that, the roof part of the garage will be, like a foot away from our fence. We have a 6-foot fence to be adjacent when, along that garage. My second sort of reason I'm objecting is just because we have a 6-foot fence, there'll be the garage will be 2 feet or 2.5 feet away from that. It'll make access for maintaining the fence or damaging the fence if somebody is even building and siding the garage or, maintaining the garage. It's just narrower than it needs to be. Sort of my third objection is, or a reason, is that there was discussion about water or about backs being higher than where Griffin and our lots are. And we get a lot of water when it rains into our yard, kind of along that fence, along where the garage will be. And so by having less, instead having only 2 feet instead of 3 feet of land there to absorb the water before it starts flowing into our yard. So prefer that, plus the gutter on the garage will be the downspout will be dispensing right at the back corner. So again, less area to absorb water and potentially more water coming into our yard, which puddles every time we get a severe rain. The last thing is I did kind of walk around Shorewood looking at, there's a lot of 2-car garages that look to be very similar situations as far as, again, I didn't go back and measure people's yards and things, but just visually looking from the sidewalk, I saw a lot of 2-car garages where, you know, the distance between the house and the garage didn't look dissimilar from our neighbor's situation. I do know that the language for the criteria is that it must be a real unique and not common situation. I think, you know, I think their situation is not unique, and I don't think there's, you know, I think it's something that they prefer, or JD Griffith or the contractor prefers, more than it's something that's absolutely necessary to pull a car out of there.
Any questions for Mr. Maloney, was it?
Have you tried to find a compromise?
I was never told about this. I got the letter, you know, in the mail, and then looked it up on, you know, on the village website. So I was never informed of this.
So I believe I understand your objection as to the side yard setback because the side yard abuts your property, correct?
Correct. Yeah. No objection to the
rear.
The rear. No,
If we're-
in
if
fact,
the-
I'd prefer that because it will indeed make it easier for them to get their car out without
Okay.
having to ship.
So your objection is to the encroachment on the side yard, which is
Correct.
the southern end of the property?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Correct.
Oh, you're in a tight lot as well. What, being in a tight lot yourself, where is your garage located in the same area or?
We actually had a garage replaced last summer, but it's a one-car garage. So we have a straight drive in. We don't about going left, get a second car on the left.
Okay.
Is that what you're asking?
And it's that far back, or do you have 3 feet on the south side yourself?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We have 3 feet on both.
In the back too?
Yeah, setbacks 3 feet on both sides. We yeah, we had it built last summer. There were no variations needed,
Okay.
but it's only a one-car.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you. Is there any other statement that you'd like to make?
No.
Any further questions for Mr. Maloney? Hearing none. One clarification stemming from that testimony is the side yard setback, the encroachment measured from the wall of the garage, not including any overhang of the eaves or gutters?
Correct. Yes, it's from the foundation. Now, while we wouldn't permit the construction of a garage where the eaves extend beyond the property line, yeah, we do take that measurement from the foundation.
Okay, so the neighbor's testimony that if it was 2 feet from the property line, there still may be some additional hangover for the eave and gutter
Yep.
over the 2 feet, perhaps only, you know, having a shorter amount of space between the property line?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Also, with the downspouts, is it in the code to not discharge into the neighbor's property or?
Yes, that is in the village ordinances. As I'm looking at the pictures, I do believe that presently there is no gutter on south side of that garage. And given the pitch of the roof there, being a hip roof, there's a gutter across the front. I don't know about the back, but there's only a gutter across the front of the garage as I can see it presently. The new design of the roof, I believe, is just straight gable. And so we would require them to install a gutter on the south side so that rain isn't rolling off and depositing, say, like towards the neighbor.
Are we ready to proceed into deliberation? Or are there any additional questions for Inspector Burris or any of the property owners? Would you like to make a rebuttal statement? You can come up to the podium if you wish.
Jim, certainly willing to discuss placement of gutters and downspouts. I was not aware that we had problems with water running into your yard, and so there will be gutters on that side. We'll also be doing drain tile around for like the retaining wall purposes, so I'm pretty sure we can find a satisfactory compromise on water not getting into the neighbor's yard. So
Thank you. All right. Well, then I will propose a motion for the purposes of deliberation to grant a request for a variance of zoning ordinance 535-19F sub 4 regarding setbacks at residential property 4144 North Morris Boulevard as meeting our criteria for granting a variance. Is there a second to enter deliberation? Thank you. Any thoughts on whether this particular property meets our criteria? I thought we were going in one direction before we received testimony from the neighboring property. And now I'm a little bit concerned about our need to find absence of detriment, but are there any thoughts anyone would like to share?
Yeah, I would hate to bring them back again, but I think try to agree on something. That's just my.
One other alternative would be to grant kind of a partial variance of granting the variance for the rear setback, but denying the request for the encroachment of the side setback if the neighbor's primary objection is the encroachment into the side setback. That's one opportunity.
Yeah, I'd find that to be far more appropriate to do, especially if there's already a major concern of detriment.
I got a question. Is this a,
Well, in the past, I've found it persuasive when it's a small lot size and the position of the garage makes it difficult to navigate if you were to have it in full compliance of the setbacks, make it difficult for a car to navigate into a garage, given that there's a corner of a house right at the end of the driveway. So I tend to find that convincing that there are unique circumstances with the position of the house that would act as circumstances for a variance, but, you know, kind of depends on the distance between the house and the garage.
We've done this before. We had one of these previous meeting where it was difficult to navigate. And we
Right.
granted variance, and that was without any neighbor objection.
Right, right. So I don't believe I've had a previous request like this where we had an objection from a neighboring property, which brings some concern into it for me.
In the circumstance of a narrow turn into the garage, front of the house, isn't unusual in Shorewood at all. We walk the streets a lot in Shorewood. Frankly, we walk by some properties and my wife and I look at each other and say, how on earth do they get in that garage? So I understand the need, especially these days where, contrary to the neighbor who has a one-car garage newly built, I think it's still the case that most homeowners, or many homeowners, have two cars and house them in a garage. So in this case, I can understand why the homeowner would be interested in doing so. But I think that the concerns raised by the neighboring property are ones that this board should take seriously. And I think that the chair's suggestion of possibly a partial variance make a lot of sense under these circumstances, since there doesn't seem to be any concern raised about the encroachment on the rear property setback.
And we do have testimony from the property owner about the condition of the east end of the property with the crumbling wood, retaining wall, and possible erosion issue, where it seems as though a good solution would be to use the foundation of a garage to act as the retaining wall there. But yeah, I share the same concerns about a neighboring property having concern about a looming garage into their backyard, the overhang of eaves, and even the concern about, you know, water discharge. So yeah, additional thoughts?
Well, is there a possibility of an architectural compromise that would satisfy both parties?
Well, I suppose we could ask the property owner, would they consent to a partial variance? Or would you need to consult your garage builder if we were to grant a variance for the east side of the property, the back setback?
Yeah. Partial variance, the most important of the two variances. You know, I'm outside and you're waiting for patio on the side of our garage. Extra foot of space with. I mean, discussions to be had.
Well, so perhaps you can come up to the podium and I'd like to propose maybe some options. Okay.
That's one.
Okay. So for the purposes of the record, can the property owner come up to the microphone just so that we can have it on record? Would the property owner like to end deliberation of this request for a variance tonight to continue discussions with the neighbor and your contractor, or would you like the Board of Appeals to proceed with its review?
Does the proceeding with review include a partial variance just to the rear?
If we were to proceed to a vote tonight, we could vote.
You could vote on a
We
partial
could vote on a
variance as
partial.
well.
But
Yeah,
I'm
I mean-
asking whether you'd like to retract your request now, if you wanted to
Do I have to
talk
pay
about.
$250 again to come back?
I don't know.
No. No, it would just be a continuance.
I mean, this also could have been a $250 conversation we had over beers or something, but
I mean, it's-
I would rather proceed if a vote on a partial variance is accepted, as my neighbor doesn't seem to want to have a conversation about a 2-foot setback.
Okay. Okay.
Is that your answer? Is that what you need?
I understand. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
All right. So would the board consider a motion for partial granting of a variance? And if so, I can propose that motion and we can proceed to a vote.
I was just going to mention, you can also grant with conditions. You have the authority to grant with conditions, be it related to downspouts or water, direct
How does
distribution.
that get
kind of
enforced though?
stuff.
If the neighbor actually argues that he's not in compliance, does it become more of a pickle for the neighboring property if there's an issue with water? Does that become
Well,
Inspector
I think
Bruce's
that's a
problem
civil
with?
matter later, but but the point is you can grant a variance with additional conditions. Like, for example, if someone said, to take again the sort of benign requests that we've seen in many occasions where somebody says, I need to put the air compressor, the air condenser for my AC in this area. The code says it has to be in this area, but it's physically impossible because I don't have enough feet to the lot line because mine is a non-conforming lot. You can say, okay, yeah, you can do that, but you can't put it anywhere you want. You have to put it within this area, so you can designate certain conditions. And I think with the code, I'm presuming the code would require downspouts and that kind of thing, right? I mean, I don't think you can build a garage without them, right?
There is a provision in the ordinance where on detached garages, gutters and downspouts may be omitted at the discretion of the building inspector. But again, in this case, and we would require a gutter on the south side of the garage.
So even if it's not technically required, you could say, that downspouts would be otherwise required.
I'm not entirely convinced that would satisfy the concerns of the neighboring property owner, so I suppose my preference would be to deny the side yard setback and potentially grant the rear setback variance. But any other thoughts on how we proceed forward?
Just a confirmation.
Okay.
The notices are sent to all the neighbors surrounding.
I think it's within a certain number
Yeah.
of feet.
200
Mhm.
foot radius.
So they should, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think it's a difficult one for you to word, Wendy. As to, because I think that we should split it up between the two of them. For the variance to the rear or to
Rear, I think.
the garage.
So
Uh,
are we in agreement that, well, I suppose our vote will count as our agreement, but is there any further discussion on whether the rear setback satisfies the criteria? If we'd like to discuss that before I propose a revised motion. Technically, we've closed testimony, so I don't want to extend this too far out, but if you'd like to come ask a question, you can. We'll find a way to address them both.
Was there a second?
I believe there was a second, yes. So I will move to amend my motion to grant a variance of zoning ordinance 535-19F sub 4 regarding the rear setback at residential property 4144 North Morris Boulevard.
Right.
That would be to grant.
You know, what might be cleaner is just ask if there's unanimous consent to withdraw the motion, and then just
Everyone.
start fresh.
Okay. All those in favor of retracting the prior motion, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, none opposed. I will propose a new motion I move to grant a variance of zoning ordinance 535-19F sub 4 regarding the rear yard setback at residential property 4144 North Morris Boulevard as meeting our criteria for granting a variance showing exceptional circumstances and an absence of detriment. Need to add the declination of the side? Or can I just leave it as a
So this-
grant of the rear setback?
No, I think you can take them separate, absolutely, because it's really two distinct requests for variance, one for the side and then one for the rear setback.
Okay,
So
period.
There's two separate.
period. So that is a motion to grant a variance for the rear setback. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Mike, can you hold a vote, please?
Wendy Smith,
Aye.
John Tuenhoff,
Aye.
Stephen Isaacson,
Aye.
Scott Walligora,
Aye.
and Kevin Matthews.
Aye.
All right. The variance is granting us to the rear setback. I'll move again for to grant a request for variance of zoning ordinance 535-19F sub 4 regarding the side setback at residential property 4144 North Morris Boulevard as meeting our criteria for granting a variance showing exceptional circumstances and absence of detriment. This would be to grant a variance. Mike, can you hold a vote, please? Or excuse me, can I have a second, please?
Second.
Thank you.
Wendy Smith,
Nay.
John Tuenhoff,
Nay.
Stephen Isaacson, Scott Walligora,
Nay.
Kevin Matthews.
Nay.
Okay. A single variance is granted for the rear yard setback. All right, moving right along. Item number 7 on our agenda. Saving the best for last. Review of a finding by the Shorewood Design Review Board that the previously approved design elements for the multifamily redevelopment located at the 2418, 2420, 2428 East Capitol Drive would not lead to a substantial depreciation of the applicant's property or neighboring properties. Attorney Baer, would you like to provide some information for us as to the standard for our review here?
Certainly. So I think we have to begin with some historical context here and go all the way back to 2022. I'm hoping that the members had an opportunity to review the memo in the packet. And if so, I won't take quite as long to go through this. But at any rate, the Atwater Apartments, which are now constructed on the properties between 2418 and 2428 East Capitol Drive, which are now finished and has residents in them. Way back in 2022, the Shorewood Design Review Board was evaluating the design elements or the aesthetic design elements of the proposed apartment complex. So this was before pre-construction. So at the conclusion of the meeting, the Design Review Board deemed that those design elements were appropriate and approved all the design elements for the project. So per the ordinance and the longstanding custom, the DRB's meeting was not recorded or transcribed. So as a result, that's part of the reason I think we went down this road is there was no subsequent reviewing body, such as the Board of Review or eventually the Circuit Court, that had the benefit of knowing exactly what the DRB noted as factoring in its approval. So the Neighborhood Association, after the March of 2022 meeting, appealed the Design Review Board's decision to the Shorewood Board of Appeals. So that came before this body on June 14th of 2022 for a hearing. And it held the hearing on the association's challenge of the approval of those elements. The association did not point to any specific design elements that they thought were visually offensive, inappropriate, or out of character for the neighborhood, but just generally objected to the scope of the construction and generally argued that despite the existing zoning, that the Design Review Board could change things such as the height and scope of the structure. So at the end of that meeting, a Board of Appeals member made the motion to, quote, deny the appeal before the board and affirm the Design Review Board's decision pursuant to the Village Code, Section 225.12, to approve the design for the proposed multifamily redevelopment located at 2418 through 2428 East Capitol Drive. So there was a second and the motion passed. On September 13th of 2022, the association filed a petition in Milwaukee County Circuit Court for what is called a certiorari review of the Board of Appeals denial of the association's appeal of the Design Review Board's approval of the design elements of the project. So structurally somewhat complex, but basically the Circuit Court was reviewing the Board of Appeals saying, yes, the Design Review Board is affirmed. So the Court of Appeals heard argument and motions and remanded the matter back to the Board of Appeals from the Circuit Court in November of 2024. And they said, the court basically at that point said that I need to basically show your work on the question of whether or not any of the design elements would cause substantial depreciation to neighboring properties. Because we don't have a recording of the original Design Review Board meeting, we can't really tell, and I don't see that fleshed out in the Board of Appeals decision. So I'm going to remand on this one very narrow issue. So the village code that existed in March of 2022 is essentially what we were looking at. That's when the Design Review Board first approved these elements. So it directed at the time the DRB to evaluate whether those elements would cause substantial depreciation to the value of the applicant's property or neighboring properties. Due to a restructuring of the code, that's no longer there, but at any rate, the court's decision, it said that it remands the matter back to the Board of Appeals for further proceedings consistent with this opinion as to substantial depreciation. The court's decision further noted the narrow scope of the additional discussion, stating that, quote, in this court's opinion, not much is required, unquote. So on December 19th, that takes us back to the Design Review Board, because when this came back to the Board of Appeals said, hey, the Design Review Board has specialized knowledge, skill, training, and experience in evaluating design elements. So we're going to send this back to them and have them have a discussion about substantial depreciation so that we have the benefit of their expertise. So we did that on December 19th of 2024. The Design Review Board went back in its DeLorean time machine to March of 2022, and they looked at the original renderings, drawings, plans, and specifications and related documents that may impact the substantial depreciation question. So they applied the standard and they said, okay, we need to go back in that time machine and have the evaluation with those same things in front of us and decide whether what's proposed here might cause any substantial depreciation. So there was a link that we put in the memo of the video recording of the Design Review Board's November 19th of 2024 meeting. And following an introduction of the issues, there was a large discussion. It starts at about the 1:03 mark, 1 hour and 3 minute mark, and there was a number of back and forth. There was a couple members that had been previously on the Design Review Board when it first came back in 2022. They noted that the body had a pretty robust discussion of the design elements, and in particular whether or not those design elements would cause any substantial depreciation to neighboring properties or the design or the construction itself. And after that lengthy discussion, the following motion was made. Quote, to close discussion to allow the meeting minutes to reflect that we, as a Design Review Board, do not anticipate substantial depreciation of this building and neighboring buildings, unquote. The motion passed unanimously. So now the matter returns to the Board of Appeals before passage back to the Circuit Court. So the Board of Appeals, in my opinion, should review the Design Review Board's discussion of substantial depreciation. And after doing so, based upon the review of the Design Review Board's discussion, the Board of Appeals should then discuss the same and entertain one of the following two motions. The first, the Board of Appeals finds that the design elements of the project located at 2418, 2020, or 2420 and 2428 Capitol Drive would not cause substantial depreciation of the property itself or neighboring properties. Or alternatively, the second motion would be the Board of Appeals finds that the design elements of the project located at 2418, 2420, and 2428 Capitol Drive would cause substantial depreciation of the property itself or neighboring properties. So the documents to be evaluated that you can evaluate are the Board of Appeals written decision from September of 2022, the Circuit Court's decision remanding the matter, the memo to the Design Review Board for its December 19th, 2024 meeting, evidence offered by the Neighborhood Association to the Design Review Board at its December 19th, 2024 meeting, and the video of the December 19th, 2024 Design Review Board meeting where they discuss the issue of substantial depreciation. So those items are part of the record. And so my suggestion is certainly you would afford the Neighborhood Association's attorney to address the body, advance any arguments he may have. And also, there was a separate counsel who was advocating on behalf of the village, who represented the village in Circuit Court. And that's Mr. Joe Worth. Mr. Sankata is here for the Neighborhood Association. Mr. Worth is here on behalf of the village. My role is merely to advise this body on procedure. So if you want to hear from those individuals, ask them to frame the arguments and tell you how they interpret the decision that was made by the Design Review Board. And then you can review the Design Review Board's discussion, make your own decision, and then entertain one of those two motions based on your own analysis. Then after the motion is made and passed, whatever that might be, the matter will proceed back up to the Circuit Court for final resolution.
Any questions for Attorney Bayer before we proceed? Hearing none. Mr. Sankata, would you like to provide a statement first, or Attorney Worth? Certainly. Mr. Worth?
Sure. I'm Joe Worth. I'm the attorney that represented the village and the Board of Appeals in the circuit court action. So I'm here principally to answer your questions, if you have any, on what the court ordered. And the difficulty, I think, that I can express to this board is that the neighborhood association and its council and I, on behalf of the village, have a disagreement on what the circuit court ordered. And I think principally what the disagreement centers around is whether the court's decision remanding the Board of Appeals vote is a requirement that the process start over from scratch. And the argument, at least the legal argument, has been that there is appellate court case law out there that says that boards of appeal on remand don't get to just do it what they forgot to do or what they neglected to do the first time around. In other words, you can't just pry open the record and shove in new evidence. It's our position that that same case does say that if the error found by the court can be rectified by a remand, that the Board of Appeals can do so. There's also a separate case that stands for the proposition that if the challenge is essentially a due process challenge, you didn't do what the process requires, the court itself can order the body to supplement the record strictly on the issue of did you or did you not do that? And what occurred down at the Design Review Board, as you'll see in the hearing, is that the members of the Design Review Board essentially said, we did that back in 2020. It's just the fact that it wasn't recorded. So they went back and they reviewed and discussed what they had discussed back in 2020. This time we recorded it. So our position is that this falls into the category, even in the case that says quasi-judicial bodies don't get to just redo what they did. That case, in case you're wondering, was the Heartland Sportsman's Club. In that case, the quasi-judicial body didn't have any discussion at all. It just voted no. And so the Court of Appeals said additional use permit, applicant met the criteria. There's nothing in the record that shows that you had any discussion at all. You just voted no. And so issue this conditional use permit. And instead, the city said, well, okay, you're saying we didn't do something, so we're going to go back on the record and do it now. This is different. This is the court in its order saying that the record currently doesn't permit the court to determine whether or not the body considered the issue of substantial depreciation. I think that's important because what the court is saying is that what it reviewed, the court was complimentary of the board's efforts in this case, of the village's efforts in this case. But what it said is the record currently doesn't permit me to see whether or not you considered this. My legal opinion that therefore falls into the category where remand to the body to say, did you or didn't you do this, is proper. When it came to the Board of Appeals, after that, the Board of Appeals said, well, we're going to send it back to the DRB because they're the ones that have the specialized knowledge. Did they do it? And when it went back to the DRB, in the recording, they said, yes, we did that. I don't even know why it's come back here, and we had to explain because it isn't in the record because there wasn't recording of the record. So what you do now is you take a look at what the DRB said and did and what the DRB relied on. All the materials that were submitted at the time are properly before you, and you're essentially deciding, was it done in 2020 such that we can take this back to the court and say, the issue of substantial depreciation was considered. It was considered in the result was that it doesn't manifest substantial depreciation. The argument that this is a do-over is a very fine line, because the neighborhood association wants to add to the record. They want to say, we've retained a real estate agent who's going to say this, and here's his report. And we want to argue that the contractor, the developer, isn't the one that put the evidence in. In my opinion, that is what Heartland Sportsman prohibits. Creating a new record, adding new evidence, shoehorning new stuff into the old decision. My opinion, my legal opinion, is that the court said, everything you did is top-notch, but I can't see currently that you considered this evidence or that you considered this issue in the old ordinance. I hereby remand on that issue. So if you have additional questions, let me know. The Neighborhood Association will present its counter argument in that respect. And then I'll defer to village attorney in terms of your procedure, because if it does continue on in litigation, I'll be the one that represents you on what you did here.
Any questions for Attorney Worth?
One, you know, not being familiar with this neighborhood association at some point was claiming construction of value.
It's a little more nuanced than that, because the actual discussion from the neighborhood association never got to the point where they're saying this will depreciate my property. But what they're saying is that this, or what they said at the time, is the scope and presence of this is inappropriate for the neighborhood. And so it was more phrased in kind of the use and application and construction, and Attorney Baer continued to kind of direct the DRB back to design, those kinds of things. So the argument, or one of the arguments we made in circuit court, is that the considerations that go on both at the DRB and here implicitly consider value and those kinds of things. And the court said, yeah, but the statute or the ordinance at the time said explicitly did it occur. So that's what we've tried to rectify.
Yeah, the context of my question is that I live in a 6-story Norwood houses that acted because scope and size of the building creates shadow, blocks the sun, whatever, probably pointing to it, but then the building was approved, it's closed. Is this a similar argument when you say neighborhood? Well, maybe he'll explain it, but the question is the construction of this building a detriment because of exterior factors, not just depreciation because it's mixed-use building in a residential neighborhood, the fact that architectural integrity of neighbors are affected by the height of this?
What I can tell you is that discussion that you're focusing on occurred before my involvement. So Mr. Sincata can better represent to you what was presented on boots on the ground at the time. Those arguments were part of the motion practice in the lawsuit. And ultimately there remains a disagreement about whether things that are proper under the zoning or meet the zoning code can nonetheless be considered by the design element of the Shorewood Village body. There's a dispute about that. And there was some discussion about that both at the time and then of 2024. We've put ourselves in a weird position where you've got a village attorney who can kind of instruct you and should, and his advice should be what you listen to with respect to the procedure and the application of the ordinance. What I can tell you is that that argument was raised in the lawsuit. But what has been remanded is almost form. And so did this body and the subordinate body consider the issue of substantial depreciation? The subordinate body that you're reviewing tonight said, yes, we did. So that's what's before you tonight.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Anybody else with questions?
Attorney Bear?
Thanks. I just wanted to throw in, because I was at the original Board of Appeals meeting before Joe Worth was involved with the lawsuit. And the question was posed to the association: what specific design element don't you like, or what design element are you complaining about that you think is a problem? And there really was no answer to that, other than, well, there isn't one, except we don't like the number of stories, we don't like the scope. And the problem was the proposal itself. The problem with that argument is the proposal itself met the existing zoning. So the amount of stories that it was built comported with the amount that was allowed under the existing zoning. So the applicant was essentially arguing that that doesn't matter, that the design review board has the power, even if the zoning allows 4 stories or 5 stories or 3 stories, to say, well, based upon our opinion, it should only be 2. I disagree with that. I gave them advice that that is not the law, that if that were, there would actually be no zoning other than what any design review board felt on any given day, what was their whim of what they would allow. There's ample case law that says when a permit applicant for a piece of construction comes with a permit that otherwise meets the underlying zoning requirements, if you pull the rug out from under them and say, yeah, this meets the number of story requirement in the zoning, but you can't do it anyway, that there's a property interest in that and you can get sued and you'll lose. So the argument was essentially extraterritorial, if you will, that the argument being advanced, in my opinion, by the association was essentially that regardless of what the zoning is, the design review board has the power to say that even if 4 stories are allowed, you can make it 3. And that's another area where we disagree on the application of the law. But at any rate, there was no specific design element that was objected to. Generally speaking, the design review board can say, look at the fixtures that are used on the outside, or this color versus that color, or the type of things that are on the windows, or generally they're specific design elements. That's the bread and butter of the design review board. Not to say, well, the code allows 4 stories, but we're only going to allow 3. So it's an apples and oranges. So the the Board of Appeals essentially said, look, if they're not complaining about any specific design element, what's the difference? And they voted. The circuit court said, well, yeah, I get that, but on the flip side, it appears to me that your ordinance requires a discussion, or at least an analysis, of whether any of those design elements would have a negative impact or materially impact the value of the design itself or the neighboring properties. In other words, if you built a cement bunker with no windows, obviously that's so ugly that it would negatively impact the value of that on day 2 after it opened, or it's so ugly that the design elements are so ugly that it impacts the neighboring properties. So again, as Mr. Worth indicated, the circuit court was complimentary of the analysis and generally the design and the construction, but said, I don't see that one issue, and I can't look back all the way down to the design review board because we don't have a recording. So I'm going to remand for that purpose. So when it got back to the Board of Appeals the first time, the Board of Appeals said, hey, we're not the experts in design elements. We're going to send it back down to the DRB. That's what the DRB did in December. They said, geez, we talked about this once. Okay, we'll talk about it again. And they made a record on it for about 45 minutes, I think, or so. So now it comes back to the Board of Appeals, and I think that, you review what the Design Review Board did and entertain one of the two motions, and then we'll send it back up. We'll send it back up to the circuit court and see what happens. So I think that's the scope of the review of this body. And certainly, the neighborhood association can argue that the Design Review Board got it wrong, and, that's their prerogative. And, you should listen to them and hear their argument and, consider their argument, and then entertain one of these two motions, and we'll send it back to the circuit court with now the record, relating to substantial depreciation, and then it'll be out of our hands.
Attorney Sincata?
Very much, Joe Sincata. I'm the attorney for the East Capitol Neighbors Association. This hasn't actually come to you on an appeal, and that's kind of relevant because I think it goes to the disagreement we have about the process we're in right now. The primary difference, well, let me go through the real basic chronology. This started at the DRB. The association and members of it now, as individual property owners, made objection to not the height, but the massing and size of the building. And they did put on the record their belief that it would impact their values at those hearings. And I believe that I think I did author a letter ahead of time that laid out that there was an ordinance that required that the Design Review Board consider and find and determine that there would be no substantial depreciation through the development of the building to the property itself or the neighboring properties. That was the language of the ordinance that existed at the time, and it exists in a slightly varied form at this point. But it's still relevant. It's what applied at the time to the developer and for the neighbors. So we made that argument, and we then appealed to the Board of Adjustment, which is required. By the way, this is a long case, a lot of years. I'm just doing what's required. So a lot of times, and thankfully the attorneys have not said, oh, no, this is taking forever and the building's up and such. I'll get to that, but they're not blaming me for just following the rules, which is what I'm doing here. The appeal initially to the Board of Adjustment was a 2-1 decision. The dissenting view was that the matter should go back to the Design Review Board and have more discussion. And actually, not just discussion, but actual factual material submitted about whether there was substantial depreciation that would be caused by the building. 2-1, so we did not prevail, and we went to circuit court. This case didn't get to the Court of Appeals. Circuit court, though acting in some ways like an appellate body. We argued at that point, we argued that the plain language of the ordinance, the law, as it were, required the Design Review Board to look at the facts and determine and make a finding of no substantial depreciation. The court agreed that that was required and was not done. The court also looked at the existing factual record to see if there were sufficient facts to support a finding of no substantial depreciation. The court found that the record was inadequate. They remanded the case. That happened actually in May. And then there was some time in the summer about figuring out the process. I actually agreed with and recommended that it be further remanded by this body to the Design Review Board. And I'll say this now and I'll say it again, but this is, I think, important. Not because the Design Review Board can inject their own kind of personal factual understandings of the village into their decision-making process. They don't bring facts to the record. They evaluate the facts that are presented with them. But because they do have some expertise in architectural design, which includes not just the features of the facade, but the placement of the building, it makes more sense for them to have the remand hearing. We called it a hearing. And that's what's required to begin with. So that was, I think, a cooperative thing where it was remanded a second time to the Design Review Board, and that occurred in December. And that was sort of a meeting of sorts. Prior to that meeting, I had suggested that really this should be a new hearing. Mr. Worth said, somewhat a do-over, but not really. A new hearing to allow the applicant to provide factual material that would be sufficient for the Design Review Board to potentially make the finding that the developer really needs in this case. We explained that in order for the Design Review Board to cure the legal error, a new supplemental hearing was required at which further facts could be provided. And then the DRB needed to make a finding that there either was no substantial depreciation or that the facts did not support that finding. In order to obtain facts that would be relevant to that finding, the DRB needed to hold a hearing, in our view, And in order to do that, it needed to inform the applicant to appear and submit any information and facts that it believed would support the finding. Yet we advised and suggested that should be done. That was not done. The neighborhood association would also participate in that hearing. However, the ordinance is set up with the burden on the applicant to provide substantial evidence from which the DRB could make its finding. And if you look at the language, and I can read it to you, but it's, well, I do have it here. This is a former ordinance 225-12. In order for the board, the design review board, to approve an application, it shall find and determine that the applicant's proposal is consistent with the design criteria and will not contribute to the substantial depreciation in the value of the applicant's property or neighboring properties. And as one of your predecessor members, I believe, maybe, I don't know if that person's on the board, the dissenting person last time understood that as putting the burden on the applicant to sort of show that it would not depreciate the neighboring properties. Court understood that, but said, yeah, that's what's required. So what's important too, and we believe prohibited by the court decisions, including this one, is that the DRB and its members are not permitted to include their own factual, really memories even, but factual information that they can pick and choose about to bring into the discussion. And I guess maybe there's a fine line between their insights as experts, but also, well, I think this building up here is relevant and I'm going to apply that. That's really for the parties to bring forward to the design review board, and they decide on that, which is why we said there needed to be a new formal hearing where the applicant would provide the facts. They're not, in our view, the DRB is not allowed to just have a discussion, as has been characterized, and remake the finding after the circuit court decision. A quote from a case, not the case that the decision in this case, but a relevant case, as Attorney Worth referenced, Heartland Sports Club. Remand to the municipality or administrative tribunal for further hearings is appropriate, one, when there is a defect in the proceeding and it can be cured, but supplementation of the record, and here's the key, by the government decision maker with new evidence or to assert new grounds is not permitted. Let me go off script a bit. What you've been presented is the idea that they did all this, they just forgot to write it down back in 20, whenever. And so let's just remember that at this second DRB hearing, and then everything will be okay. That's not how we recall it, and the members of the association did object. They also made point that the applicant didn't provide information from which they could make this finding. I'm going to pause here. I'm going to quote the court case. This is important from our standpoint. The idea that there were the facts and they were kind of latent in the record, and the DRB members who were there at the time could kind of bring them up and bring the new DRB members up to speed. You know, that sounds like, oh, well, they're doing their best. But it's really not sufficient under the way the court evaluated the current record and decided the case. Page 47 of the court decision. This is a circuit court decision by Judge McAdams that remanded the case here. This is very near the end of the case. The record here, however, gives the court no factual basis upon which to find and to determine substantial depreciation of the neighboring properties, you know, or not. So, and there's other points in the case, in the decision, where the court makes clear the record as it stands, as the court had it at the time, was inadequate. The DRB would not have been acting according to law if it had found that there was no substantial depreciation, because the court found there wasn't sufficient facts to allow that finding. And that's relevant because then when you go back to the DRB as in December and you don't allow new factual information to be entered in the record, you are essentially having a do-over. You're basically asking the DRB to show their work and think about what they did in the past, and then sort of bring up to speed the new members, and then have this discussion, and then reconsider the matter. And I think that is directly contrary to this Heartland Sportsman Club case and the due process clause. Another quote from that is as such, the government decision maker's grounds must be established at a single proceeding. To permit a second hearing would be analogous to allowing the second trial to shore up the record to support the judgment, which of course violates due process. Pretty strong language for our position. Mr. Attorney Worth references kind of a third way here. The idea that, well, a circuit court can allow supplementation of the record with, I guess, kind of previously understood facts but not articulated facts, or they weren't put on the audio or whatever, to cure due process violation. The problem with that is due process violations are imposed upon private parties, not governments. So to allow the government decision maker to go back and have a proceeding in which they are kind of generating new factual conclusions from the existing record, we believe continues creating an error here in the process. That's the core problem from our standpoint legally, that the design review board hearing, which is in front of you, did not satisfy what the circuit court required or what its decision requires and what the law requires. That proceeding needed to be a new hearing. And frankly, in some ways generously, the applicant should have been provided the opportunity to come forward with new factual information to satisfy the standard it was operating under at the time, which is to provide factual information that showed that their project as proposed, now built, would not substantially depreciate the neighboring properties. I encouraged that to happen, but that was not the course of action that the village attorney believed was correct. And that's not what happened at the DRB. So very simply, we believe that was an error of law and that this body should remand back to the DRB with more specific instructions on what to do. Now, some context, just as I can, to talk about the court decision, which is long and which my colleague, my opposing counsel, have not really cited that much. But one statement in the court's decision does seem to get a lot of attention. Page 46 of the court's decision, the court says, while in this court's opinion, not much is required. But that needs to be read in context. The full sentence is, while in this court's opinion, not much is required, it is not this court's place to substitute its own determination of the facts and their meaning in the place of that of the lower body. However, 2 pages earlier in the court decision, or a few pages earlier, the court was commenting on the idea that the ordinance requires the body to prove a negative. The transcription above makes clear that the board members were made aware of the provisions of their ordinance, but by a majority of 1 vote, decided to move past them. And 1 member of the board majority derisively called the requirement proving a negative. There is some truth to this, but find and determine is what the authors of the ordinance wrote and required. And the court leaves a footnote. Footnote 15, the court does not view this requirement as particularly onerous. It can be met by testimony, expert testimony, or documentary evidence, like any other criterion. So read in the context, the idea that not much is required, which Judge McAdams put in his circuit court decision, I think that my opposing counsel have taken that out of context. What that means is not much factual material is required. Not the idea that not much activity is required by the DRB. They can just kind of have a meeting and internally discuss what happened before and then say, yeah, we meant to make that finding, but we forgot to, so we'll do it now. That's not, I believe, what the court meant to say when they said not much is required. I wanted to provide that, at least on my position on why that is easily, I think, misconstrued. Finally, there is a good reason for pursuing a case like this in many instances. The case matters because without proper DRB approval of the project, which is still in jeopardy in our view, it is not entitled to a building permit. Thus, should a court ultimately rule that the DRB did not approve the project according to the ordinances, then the building would not be compliant. The village then would be required to enforce the laws determined by the court. Of course, the village has discretion. They could seek forfeitures or require some other mitigation of the negative impact on the neighborhood. Of course, if we prevail, then the presumption is there is a negative impact. By the way, to your question earlier, comments were made by neighbors at the time very close by who are part of the association now that they believe the massing of the building and the size of it and the tightness of it filling up the whole parcel would affect parking and would in other ways, shadowing and otherwise, and then in the close presence of it, impact their properties negatively as to their value. So that was put on the record by some of the neighbors. What didn't happen at the first DRB meeting is that the applicant didn't provide information contrary. That was the core problem. The association, like any developer, is required to exhaust its remedies. That's why I'm here tonight in part, before potentially seeking any monetary damages for diminution in value. That's another reason why this matter is continuing. The proper course of action from our view is that the Board of Appeals should remand the matter back to the DRB with instructions to hold a hearing where further evidence on the issue of substantial depreciation could be provided by the parties. That's the applicant and the neighbors. The DRB is not permitted to inject facts into the record at this stage, nor is the city staff. That's our view of the thing. And that's to be consistent with the Heartland Sportsman Club case, which says the government decision maker can't add new facts to the record. This may seem like a relatively small case, and maybe it is, but the Heartland Sportsman Club case went on for quite a while because the property owner there happened to want to have gun shooting at their property. They wanted that to happen, and there was a resistance at the village level. And the court, I think, rightly noted in the decisions that if the village has to do something and do it right the first time, and they can't kind of keep having these, well, I feel bad about saying this. I don't have cats, but the second kick at the cat, which is the language in the court decision, kind of hard on cats, but they can't keep doing that. Why? Well, because it's the government. And they have to be held to a fairly strict standard to provide due process. We're a neighborhood association. I've often said in court hearings that neighboring properties have equivalent constitutional due process property rights as developers. And one judge asked me for authority on that. I only had the Constitution, but I think that's sufficient. And I don't say that in too much levity. It's important, though, that we have a perspective. What if it was the developer here who had not had what they viewed a proper procedure below, and was, for instance, required by the DRB to make their building much smaller? They thought that was wrong. Now, I'll speak a little bit about that issue as well, because I think it's a distraction, although it's part of it. They would be here. They would be doing this. And we would be, well, you know, it's their property. It's our property too. That is ours, not mine, but the members. So when these cases go along and they seem to be a little fussy, the building's up, and why are these neighbors continuing to do this? It's about the same issue, protecting their property value and their property rights. And as I said at the last meeting, I think of the board, that's what the ordinance was designed to do. It put in the language about having the DRB make that determination as part of the initial process to avoid litigation. Have the DRB do a comprehensive, as best they can, evaluation. Public policy of the village wrote the ordinance and said, DRB determined that this won't substantially depreciate. Because why? We care about the neighbors. So when that's followed in a reasonable fashion, then I think you avoid the litigation. But we didn't think it was, and so we proceeded. I do want to comment to try to clear it up. I disagree that there is some limitation on the design review board's scope of what it can review about a particular project. There's had experience with many ordinances, and I have one cited in my materials, but the idea that the focus needs to be on facade features only, and that the massing and size of the building can't be considered by architectural professionals when they're making a judgment about this, doesn't make sense in the world of architecture. I mean, no architects would ever say that. That they consider the surroundings, of course, and that matters. It impacts the surroundings. The idea that because the zoning allows 4 stories, they can't make it smaller than that or lower than that, or they can't limit the footprint. It's not in the law. That's not reflected anywhere in anything that's been cited anywhere in the case. It's not a takings, and this happens all the time. Zoning isn't a takings if it's done reasonably. So design review boards, like historic preservation boards, good analogy, do have power, and they can make decisions that limit the maximum amount of return a developer can get. Can they wipe out the developer fully? That's a taking. But they certainly have room before that to limit what a project might look like. Having said this, I want to make that point because we disagree on that with the village attorney, but that's really not at issue here. What's at issue here is, did the design review board proceed according to what the law required in terms of the remand hearing? The hearing or the meeting that was had was a discussion of the board. They recollected, they kind of talked about the minutes. They recollected the past meetings. I was allowed to say some words. I did make an offer of proof of an affidavit by a real estate expert that said, this does substantially depreciate. That was my obligation because I didn't want to maybe say, you guys got to do this and then not have nothing. So I brought it forward. I don't think it was necessarily considered in a formal manner, but it was good that I was able to be there. But I still think that proceeding was not adequate. So that's the core issue. Was that proceeding adequate according to the law? This is fairly complicated. We have many attorneys arguing different, in some ways, very different ideas. So I understand that can be a challenge, but I appreciate the time. We are in earnest here. We care about the village as much as anybody. I am from Sherwood. I happen to be doing this case not necessarily because of that, but in part because of that. And we want it to run well. And in some ways, the folks that are on this, in this group just don't think it ran well here. And that's also part of this. So thank you very much. I'm happy to hear any questions, but I've probably talked enough. So thanks. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Is the building's up?
Yes, I'm driving by it all the time.
Yeah. And so where is this? I mean, I'm just practical.
Yeah.
Where is this going? Is this going to, neighbors are now going to show up at the Board of Tax Review Board and say, production? Because this has impacted the value of my house? Is that what's next?
So let me give you a long answer, because what you raised is an important issue, and it's really one that I probably talked too fast about, but it's at the core of this balance between neighbors and the subject property. That can happen. Gravel pit goes in. I've got a gravel pit case up in the county of Washburn, and we had a letter from the assessor. He said, "Yeah, I'm getting requests for assessors reassessments already because it's going to diminish surrounding property value." That can happen on an individual basis. The neighboring property owners, probably the ones that are closest, would possibly have a private cause of action under sort of a nuisance theory that says, well, you're damaging my value. And I believe it's a nuisance, and so I'd like some monetary compensation for that. I'd also like better light, air, and less shadowing. That's another basis for standing or seeking damages. That could be where this is going. What's required under the law is that you, as an objector, property owner, exhaust your remedies. This started out prior to the building going up in an effort to stop it from going up so that this would be done before construction. And so we were trying to exhaust our remedy. But they proceeded to go, they had notice. I emailed the developer's attorneys and they went ahead. So now where are we? Well, we have a building that's up. So it can practically, to your point, a judge is not going to be thrilled about saying, all right, rip it down. That's a tough ask for a court. It's got to be there in theory, but it's unlikely that would come. However, it's important that we establish a record of what happened, whether there was an error of law, what the factual findings were, in case we do want to pursue some kind of monetary relief. So that, I think, is the answer to that question. If I've done it okay, I'm talking probably a little too fast, but that's where it's going. I think this particular case is going back to circuit court, one with the other, to see if we're right about what the judge meant or if Mr. Worth is, and unless I think this body remands it to the DRB.
Well, let me jump in here for a minute. The reason I'm asking this question, and the question for the village, I'm on the tax review board.
Yeah.
I might hear this case.
You might. Yeah.
And I want to know what to do because I've heard this.
Yeah.
And I'm going to vote on this. How does that impact my serving on that committee?
And Attorney Barrett can give you more details. That would be context, to my understanding, that you're aware this happened, but I think you'd have to take that on an individual basis. So I wouldn't say that what I'm doing here necessarily is evidence in a tax reassessment open book type proceeding.
But we can see where this is going.
It could go that way. Now, is the assessment going to be that much less? Probably it's going to be not going to go up as much. What's going to happen because there'll be a depression, a suppression of the value, the growth of the value. Very few properties are, go down in assessment when you get a project next door. But what they do is they don't grow as much. Substantial depreciation, the term. I think that encapsulates that idea. And just to put another point on that, sometimes you'll be at a hearing and someone will say, well, that gravel pit went in on such and such and my property values kept going up. Well, that's not really the point. Are they going up like they would if it wasn't there? That's kind of the point. So in the assessment case, it may be a very sort of fine difference in your situation. That is the type of thing that can happen, though, when a project goes awry and it turns out to be a detriment to the neighbors.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I can stand. You can hear me talk. You can do it well. So.
I had a question. We talk about the neighbor.
Yeah, Mr. Walsh is here. I won't call him up, but it is. It's Mr. Walsh lives nearby. He's got a couple of duplexes. There's other people that are right nearby on Stoll, some that are south of Capitol that are also on Stoll. I think there's about 10 or 12 members of the association that are core members. During the objection period and the hearings, there was many more neighbors that were objection and filed things. They're a little further away to some extent. Having said that, part of our concern is that this development ended up taking away an opportunity from the area that could have had it grow in value in a way that's similar to where the Cornerstone is and such. And so the impact on people is broader than just the immediate neighbor. But they are here. They're part of that membership.
But I mean, what's wrong? At what point?
It becomes a little more indirect. It's true. Yeah. So the law would kind of pull you back and saying, well, are the nearby neighbors damaged economically? And we put in an affidavit that said, yeah, they are. We don't have a number on that yet, but that's not what's required to have standing to bring an objection. It's also not what's required under the ordinance. The finding was will not substantially depreciate, meaning if you found it would substantially depreciate, doesn't require the design review board to pick a number. It says, is it going to do that or not? But hopefully I'm answering your question. There are plenty of property owners that are involved in the association that do believe their property has been affected by this way in a negative fashion.
I have a question about process for the board at this juncture. I understand that the association is asking for us to find error by the DRB and send it back to the DRB for opening of a hearing to consider new evidence. Is that correct?
New evidence, if the applicant decides to provide it and or allow the neighborhoods to provide it, yes.
Okay.
But it's constrained to new evidence by the body that, or by the entity that can provide it. In this case, which is only for our purposes, the applicant, not the DRB itself or the staff.
Okay, so if we were to, say, take the board's council's advice and decide not to find error in how the DRB proceeded, what is your expectation of the board tonight as to whether your position is that the board should look at the substance of whether there has been substantial depreciation, or whether the board is merely taking note that the DRB has made a determination and then it proceeds to the circuit court, however our many attorneys wish for it to go. So I'm a little bit unclear about what is it that we're doing tonight, and that's open to any.
I'm sure they'll have
attorney.
thoughts on that. My thought would be if the board had taken this matter with the idea that it would make the substantive decision that there is not substantial depreciation, then it could make that as part of its order. It's not acting in that capacity. It remanded to the design review board to do the substantive evaluation. So it seems to me it would be appropriate and consistent for the design review board or for the board of adjustment, this body, to limit its evaluation to the legal issue, but whether the design review board acted properly under the law, first determining what was required. Part of that is what did they have in front of them? Was there enough to make this finding? We say there isn't, but the other councils say there is. I don't think it would be appropriate for this body to kind of pull that decision from the design review board and say, yeah, I've seen the record and I don't think there's going to be substantial appreciation. Having said that, the state statute, which enables boards of adjustment, does provide a board of adjustment broad authority to, in fact, the exact language is to make the decision that ought to be made. So you have that authority from the enabling statute, but the way the cases are, it's about what is the process at the local level. So for me, I would suggest that it would be consistent and required that you limit your view to what the DRB did right or wrong versus trying to support their decision by making factual findings about substantial appreciation, if that makes sense. And I'm
Attorney
sure
Baker, any
council may have thought on that. So
Yeah, so I guess, and you
and
know,
I'll step back. I've been talking plenty. If you want me
oh,
to.
I didn't, if you're not finished, though, I'd be happy to let.
No,
you-
if I feel like I want to chime in, maybe I'll ask.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't interrupting. Joe, do you want to go first? Is that, okay.
Because it kind of goes to what your last question was. There's been some representation, argument on what was required at the DRB under the ordinance. Been presented to you several times that the requirement is that the developer have produced something at the DRB on the issue, that the developer has to do. What the ordinance actually says is that the design review board can approve an application in approving an application, it shall find and determine that the applicant's proposal is consistent with the design criteria and will not contribute to substantial depreciation in the value of the applicant's property or the neighboring properties. The ordinance under which the Design Review Board operates speaks to its finding about the proposal. Doesn't speak to who has the burden of proof or who's supposed to produce X or Y or affidavits. And so I give you that background as the actual quotation of the ordinance under which it operated. I can also tell you that in the court's decision, it cites with approval a case that contains the following language. We read defendant to argue that the expert testimony was required to show depreciation in the property values of other property. He cites the rule that a trial court may take judicial notice of the facts that are verifiable certainty. In other words, the Design Review Board can decide a case on what its members know, on what its expertise they bring to the decision-making process. And finally, I give you this only as the background for our legal position that, in fact, what you are doing tonight is deciding whether the Design Review Board properly followed the court's order, as opposed to whether or not you're going to make an independent decision. Here's the court's order. The court finds that the record is currently inadequate to determine if the BOA properly considered whether the proposed housing would cause substantial depreciation to the neighboring properties. And then it says, moreover, the court cannot on its own determine from the record whether there was sufficient information on substantial depreciation. Therefore, it reverses and remands the matter back to the BOA for further proceedings consistent with this opinion as to substantial depreciation. So you've heard the neighborhood association's interpretation of that. We are oddly in agreement that the board's job tonight is to determine whether or not the record now contains substantial or proper material that a court can review on the issue of substantial depreciation to the neighboring properties. So I think you're in the position like Attorney Baer suggested, and he'll be the one that gives you the actual legal advice on procedure in this case. But I don't think you're in the position tonight where you have to independently find on the issue of substantial depreciation. You have to determine whether what the court ordered happened. Does the record now support that the decision included consideration of substantial depreciation? And vote on that element of it, because then we'll take it back to the court and say, did we do the right thing? So.
Thank you. Attorney Baer.
Thank you. And generally, I agree with that. But for context, for those of you that haven't been around for this whole journey, I want to go back to the 2022 original Design Review Board meeting. They did because they told us when we went back on remand in December that they followed the ordinance and they had a discussion as to whether or not any of the design elements of the proposed construction would have a substantial impact or substantial negative impact on any of the neighboring properties. Now, the association absolutely 100% has a right to disagree with that, and they exercise their right. They brought that before the Board of Appeals. And when they brought that before the Board of Appeals and said, we think the Design Review Board is wrong in its decision, the Board of Appeals turned to them and said, well, tell us, what's the problem? What's the design element that you're objecting to that you think will substantially depreciate neighboring properties? Is it the roof? Is it the window treatments? Is it the doors? Is it the siding? Is it, the color? What is it? Tell us. And the only answer was the size. And the problem with that is the zoning itself determines the size of the footprint of the construction on that piece of particular property. The setbacks, the height, all of that is designed by the underlying zoning. And I respect Mr. Sincata, but I think he's wrong when he tells you that that the design review board can say, well, it's 5 stories, but we think it should be 3, or yeah, the setback is 5, but we think you should shrink it and move it in. Can't do that. If that were the case, the design review board doesn't have that power. If that were the case, the actual zoning would be whatever the design review board felt it should be at any given particular meeting with those specific group of people on that day. And that's not how the law works. There's ample case law that says if an applicant submits a request for a building permit that meets all of the underlying criteria of the zoning, and the design review board says, yeah, we don't like 5 stories, it's 3, you're going to get sued and you're going to lose, because there's a property interest once you submit an application that otherwise complies with the underlying zoning. So again, this is a lot simpler than it's being made out to be. The design review board originally said, we evaluated this. We don't find any of the design elements, i.e. the roof, the siding, the color, all of those things that are within our purview. None of that has a negative impact on the neighboring property values. It came before the Board of Appeals. The Board of Appeals said, well, you're not telling us anything that's a design element that you think would substantially depreciate. We don't have to prove the negative. So they affirmed it. It went up to the circuit court, and the circuit court said, I'm reading right from the decision here. Obviously, a lot of time and effort went into the approval process here, and the hearings were lengthy and professionally run. It says there's a lot of information in the 500 or so pages of the record, much of which is design schematics and meeting minutes, unquote. And then it says what's left here isn't a whole lot. The court just said, look, I don't see in the record where there was ample discussion. It's not fleshed out. It's the equivalent of, having the answer right on the math test and the teacher writes, show your work. I don't see where, I can't tell where originally the design review board talked about substantial depreciation. And I don't see it with respect to the Board of Appeals, because again, they didn't have the benefit of a recording of the underlying design review board meeting. They said, well, send it back. I want to see what the conclusions are in relation to substantial depreciation. So when it came back here again, the Board of Appeals said, hey, design review board, you're the experts. We're going to send this back to you. Design review board did their work. They did their job in December, and now it's back here again. So essentially, my opinion is that Mr. Worth is correct, that you've got 2 options, and there's 2 proposed motions in the memo. And it's essentially, that you can find that the Board of Appeals, or the Board of Appeal finds that the design elements of the projects located at 2418, 2420, and 2428 Capitol Drive, it's supported by the design review board's discussion that those would not cause substantial depreciation of the property itself or the neighboring properties. Those design elements wouldn't cause that. Alternatively, you could review the design review board's discussion, watch their video, and say, hey, we disagree. The Board of Appeals finds that we're not satisfied by the design review board's discussion, and we do find that it would cause substantial depreciation of the property itself or the neighboring property. So I think you're essentially doing what you would have done the first time around had you had the benefit of having the design review board meeting recorded. So you can watch that video, you can make a determination and decide whether there's ample record on substantial depreciation, and then we'll pass it back up to the circuit court, and the circuit court will either do one of 2 or 3 things. It'll either say, I'm satisfied now that you've shown your work. I get it. I now see what the design review board did the first time around, They confirmed it again by rehaving that same discussion. And I agree, and we're all done. You can all go home, or they'll say, no, that's not enough. They'll agree with Mr. Sincata and they'll send it back for further proceedings. I don't believe that's going to happen, but who knows? Or third, they could split the baby somewhere down the middle and say, okay, well, I agree with this, but not that, and I'll send it back for additional limited review. My belief is, having sat through the design review board meeting, is that they complied with the direction of the circuit court. They had a substantial discussion about whether those design elements, which are under their purview, could cause substantial depreciation. They had a learned discussion based upon their knowledge, skill, training, and experience, and they made a motion. And now the Board of Appeals, you can review that motion. And did they get it right? Based upon the record that they made, is there substantial evidence in the record to support that? Then we're going to send it back to the circuit court, and whatever happens, happens. And I think that's, I don't overthink it. Clearly, the directive from the circuit court is clear. Says that I don't need, we don't, certainly a new hearing wasn't contemplated. And so let's send the record from the design review board back to the circuit court and let the judge determine whether that's adequate. So that would be my advice.
Attorney Sincata, do you have any additional statement?
And I disagree on this, but the position he's suggesting is that the design review board did a fine job because they considered the design elements. That's all they can consider. And we didn't have anything to say about the design elements. Well, we did. But for us, size, massing, the closest to the property lines are things that the design review board can consider. So for our position, this argument was made in the circuit court case, and the judge did not agree with that. He didn't really have to agree with it. But if he would have agreed that only fenestration, for instance, can be considered, the design review board considered that. We would have not objected to that. We would have lost. But the case was sent back. So the issue of whether the design review board is required to consider more than just window features, as an example, may be before you in your minds. And so I didn't want to respond on that. So Attorney Baer does give some commentary on this, but the ordinance helps us here. The ordinance that existed at the time, 225-12B, gives the intent and purpose of the ordinance. General language to promote the public health, safety, convenience, prosperity, comfort, and general welfare of the citizens of the village, and to strike a reasonable balance between the desire of the property owner to choose the design of his or her land use and the continuing interest of the village in the design and appearance of that property by, and there's three considerations, protecting the general appearance of building structures, landscaping, and open areas. This is what the design review board is supposed to consider. Ensuring adequate light, air, and privacy for the property, and encouraging and promoting acceptability, attractiveness, and compatibility of new buildings, development, remodeling, and additions so as to maintain established standards and property values. So, and there's more. It goes through design criteria. Attorney Baer's understanding of the ordinance, I think, is really not well anchored in the ordinance themselves. There's no reference to design elements in the relevant ordinances. They give design criteria and guidelines, some of which I've just read. So it is important, at least, that you know our position. The DRB erred, in our view, the first time and continued to, because if their decision is, as Attorney Baer is saying, was perfectly fine. They know that they can't rezone the property by saying it's lower in height, which we don't agree with. So they stayed away from that. They just looked at the windows, and that's what they did. And you don't even object to that, neighborhood association. So what are we here for? Very simple. Not simple. Okay? That's why we came in with property value information. That's why the ordinance says property values are important. If a 25-story building is going to be put up next to a small bunch of residences in Wauwatosa, and the developer says, you know what, if I make the floors, if I make it really narrow, I can satisfy the floor area ratio of the code. And then I can call it a permitted use. I don't need any permits, but I still need design review board approval. It's 24 stories high, and it's next door to single residential homes in another zoning district. Does the design review board get to consider that? Why would this body and why would the village want to take power away from the design review board? and saying, well, we can't really have an impact sometimes. We have to let that go because the zoning says you could do it in the right circumstances. You can have a tall building in the right circumstances. Said simply, because it's a permitted use doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. You still have to get building permits, certificates of occupancy, and in this case, approval by the design review board. So the building permit cases that Attorney Bear is mentioning that vested rights, they never vested because we challenged the DRB approval, which is a prerequisite to getting the building permit. So then the argument becomes, well, the challenge you're making to the DRB approval is you're asking them to do something that's beyond their purview. I would argue that's not consistent with the ordinance. And to the extent that is part of your analysis, I would ask you to please look at the ordinances and determine if those ordinances do limit the design review board in that way that's being suggested. Thank you very much.
Attorney Worth, did you have any comment that you'd like to provide? All right. Okay. So Attorney Bear, I would like to propose, this is a slight modification of the motion that you proposed. And I think it reflects what you just said, but I'd like to kind of run it past you to get your understanding of. So if we were to make a motion that the Board of Appeals finds that the record generated by the Design Review Board in its meeting on December 19th, 2024 is adequate to support its finding that the project located at number Capitol Drive, I'll fill in those numbers later, would not cause substantial depreciation of the property itself or neighboring properties. Would that be sufficient as a motion? As we're acknowledging that what the Design Review Board was adequate.
And the positive of that, I'm sure Mr. Sakata would tell you, would be alternative.
Right.
Either does or doesn't.
I think that form is appropriate.
Okay.
That's what you got.
Okay. Okay. Is there any other statement on behalf of the parties before we move into deliberation or discussion? Hearing none. I will make a motion. I move that the Board of Appeals finds that the record generated by the Design Review Board in its meeting on December 19th, 2024 is adequate to support its finding that the project located at 2418, 2420, and 2428 Capitol Drive would not cause substantial depreciation of the property itself or neighboring properties. Is there a second for us to move into deliberation?
Second.
Thank you. All right. Is there a need for further discussion? We've had lots of talk about this amongst board members. Is there anyone that would like to voice any opinions here?
Well, with all the parties in agreement, I mean, they both agreed on that motion that we're going to be sufficing what Judge McAdams requested here on page 48 with these three, right?
Well, I think that Attorney Sakata disagrees that it was adequate.
No, I'm
but
talking about
just
the
the
judge.
structure of the
I'm saying.
motion. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think we can vote on the motion.
Okay. Any other further statement? Comments? Are we ready to proceed to a vote? All right. Yes. Okay. Would anyone like to flesh out that record for us? We've heard from Attorney Worth, Attorney Sakata, and the board's attorney Bear relating to this underlying matter. The agenda has provided us with the record generated by the Design Review Board in its meeting on December 19th on remand. I'll keep talking over that siren. And from my review of the materials and in consultation with our attorney, it seems as though the record generated in that meeting would satisfy the circuit court's requirement that the design review board support its finding of the project not causing substantial depreciation of the property or the neighboring properties. Any further statement? Anyone would like to reiterate what it is that we heard and what we think?
Well, I would simply add, and I would concur that the record that's been available to us tonight, I'm satisfied that the Design Review Board did consider these issues before it and made a finding based upon a consideration of the evidence submitted to it in the earlier hearing, as well as the hearing in December of 2024, and considered at that time the issue of substantial depreciation and found that project as proposed cause any substantial property.
Thank you. Any further statements, comments? Hearing none. Are we ready to proceed to a vote?
Can you restate the motion then?
Yes.
Yeah.
The motion is for a finding by the Board of Appeals that the record generated by the Design Review Board in its meeting on December 19th, 2024 is adequate to support its finding that the project located at 2418, 2420, and 2428 Capitol Drive would not cause substantial depreciation of the property itself or neighboring properties. Mai, can you call a vote, please?
Wendy Smith,
Aye.
John Tuenhoff,
Aye.
Stephen Isaacson,
Abstain.
Scott Walligora,
Aye.
Kevin Matthews.
Aye.
Motion passes. I believe that is the end of our agenda. Unless there is any lingering matter associated with the Neighbors Association, Attorney Bayer, is that the end of our business?
I think that's the end of the.
Okay. As we have gone through our agenda tonight, I'll move to adjourn the meeting. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks.
How did the BRB get the time machine?